Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was a small, crumbling building with a faded sign hanging crookedly above the door. The Hollow Inn. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but a faint light flickered from inside, and the windows weren't boarded up, so I figured it might still be open. I knocked at the door, my knuckles trembling slightly from the cold. A moment passed before it creaked open. A woman stood there, her face pale and slightly weathered, but her smile was kind. "Are you here for a room?" she asked, her voice soft, almost too soft. I nodded. She gestured for me to come in. Inside, the inn was dimly lit by a few flickering lanterns. The furniture was old, dusty wooden chairs, worn rugs, and portraits on the walls that seemed to watch me with strange, hollow eyes. It was almost like stepping into another time, a place forgotten by the world. "How long have you been running this place?" I asked, trying to make small talk. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she led me down a narrow hallway to a room at the back of the inn. The door creaked open, revealing a modest, dimly lit bedroom. A single bed with faded linens sat against the far wall, and an antique mirror hung over a dresser. "Thank you," I said, feeling a mix of unease and exhaustion. She nodded, but there was something about her eyes, something unsettling. "You'll be fine here. Rest well." As she closed the door behind her, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to shake it off and sat on the bed looking out the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across the ground, and the wind rustled the trees outside. But the feeling didn't go away. It was as if something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence in the room felt oppressive, and I kept hearing faint noises, scratching sounds, soft whispers, like something was moving around just outside my door. I checked the lock on the door, but it was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I heard it again, a soft thump, followed by a creak of floorboards. Someone, or something, was moving. I got out of bed and crept toward the door. The hallway was dark, the lanterns barely illuminating the edges of the walls. The scratching noises came from further, down the hall now, followed by a low, rasping breath that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know whether to investigate or lock myself in the room and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But my curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise was louder now, coming from a door at the far end of the hallway, one I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and I could see a flicker of movement inside. I approached cautiously, my breath shallow. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The room was empty, except for the woman from earlier, standing in front of a full-length mirror. She was staring at her reflection, but her eyes were empty, her expression blank. Then I heard it again, the rasping breath. It came from behind me. I whipped around, my pulse racing, but the hallway was empty. Still, I could feel it, a presence, lingering just out of sight. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor, my body frozen in place. The woman in the mirror suddenly turned toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, her lips parted, but the sound that came from her mouth was not a voice. It was a low, guttural growl, like something far darker than a human could produce. "Leave," she whispered, but her voice was not her own. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had been waiting for years. I stumbled backward, slamming into the doorframe, my heart racing in my chest. My body moved on instinct, and I bolted from the room, rushing back to the safety of my own. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards set my nerves on edge. But when morning came, the inn was still quiet. the sunlight breaking through the windows as if nothing had happened. I grabbed my things and rushed to the front desk. The woman from the night before was gone, replaced by an older man who looked at me with a puzzled expression when I asked about her. "Sorry, miss, but there's no one else here," he said. "We don't have any other staff." I looked around, but there was no sign of the woman, no trace of the presence I had felt the night before. I left without another word, my skin prickling with the feeling that I was being watched the entire time. But as I stepped outside into the morning light, I glanced back at the inn. The windows were dark, empty, except for one, a single room at the far end of the building. In the window, a shadow stood, watching, and I knew without a doubt that the inn had never been empty at all. I had a late meeting and needed to catch the last train home. The station was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that made everything seem off. The platform was dim, lit only by a few scattered lights that flickered as if they couldn't decide whether to stay on. The train, when it arrived, was odd, old, with peeling paint and windows covered in grime. But I was too tired to care and climbed aboard. The train wasn't crowded, just a few passengers scattered in different cars. I found a seat near the back and settled in, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The air smelled strange, like wet metal and dust, and the rhythmic clacking of the wheels seemed almost too loud in the silence. As the train started moving, I tried to relax, but my thoughts kept wandering. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I glanced around, but no one was paying attention to me. There was an elderly woman sitting across from me, her eyes fixed on the floor, and a man at the far end of the car staring out the window. The other passengers were unremarkable, just the usual tired commuters, but something about the stillness in the air felt wrong. Suddenly, the train lurched, and the lights flickered violently. The entire car seemed to shake, and I heard a muffled thud from somewhere ahead. The train slowed to a crawl, and the eerie silence returned, even more oppressive than before. The windows, which I had assumed were dirty, now looked completely black, as though they had been sealed shut from the outside. I stood up, heart racing, and walked toward the door that separated the cars. Something wasn't right. I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I tugged harder, panic starting to set in, but the door was sealed tight. Then I heard it, a faint whispering coming from the darkened windows. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent. "Get off! Leave now!" I backed away from the door, my breath shallow. The train had stopped entirely now, and the whispering grew louder, almost like a chorus, but I couldn't make out the words. They seemed to be coming from every direction at once. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned toward the elderly woman, hoping for some kind of explanation. But she was staring at me now, her eyes wide, unblinking. Her mouth was moving, but no sound came out, only the whispers. It felt like the train itself had become a living thing, a thing that wanted me to stay, but not in a way that felt safe. It wanted me to stay for its own reasons. The train lurched again, and this time the lights went out completely. The car was plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. My legs froze, unable to move. A faint click echoed through the darkness, followed by a low, guttural sound. I knew then that something had boarded the train with us. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mind raced, and I fumbled for my phone, but the screen was dead. I felt something brush against my leg, a cold, skeletal touch that sent a chill crawling up my spine. Then I heard the footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps that moved closer with every passing second. The whispering was gone, replaced by the sound of slow, deliberate steps coming toward me. And then, silence. I didn't dare move, afraid that any sound I made would draw its attention. I stared into the darkness, heart thumping, every muscle in my body locked in terror. Then, out of the blackness, two glowing eyes appeared. They were distant at first, but they grew larger and larger until I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the edge of the train. It was tall, unnaturally so, and as it moved closer, the train began to shake again. With a sudden burst of courage, I shoved at the door one last time. This time it gave way and I stumbled into the next car. I didn't look back, just ran blindly through the darkened train, my breaths ragged and heavy. I heard the footsteps following me. Louder now, closer, and the whispering resumed, now speaking my name. I reached the next door, and to my relief, it opened easily. I ran through it and into the next car, only to stop dead in my tracks. The seats were empty. Not just empty, vacant. There were no signs of the other passengers. The car was bare, its walls rusted, the floor covered in dust, as though it had been abandoned for years. I stumbled back, my heart in my throat. I turned, expecting to see the glowing eyes of whatever had been following me, but instead I saw a faint light up ahead, an exit. I dashed toward it, my feet pounding against the old train car, but just before I reached it, a cold hand wrapped around my wrist. I spun around in horror, but there was nothing behind me. Just the train, moving steadily through the darkness. Woke up in my own bed the next morning, sweat-soaked and heart racing, but I could still hear the whispers, soft, insistent, echoing in my mind. I had never seen the door before. It wasn't there the day before, nor the day before that. The apartment I had rented was old, but I had become familiar with every inch of it over the past few weeks. The creaky floors, the cracked ceiling, the narrow hallway. It was all the same. But one night, after a long shift, I came home to find a door at the far end of the hall that had never been there before. It was just a door, nothing special. Wooden, chipped at the edges with a tarnished brass handle. Yet the sight of it gave me a chill. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or perhaps the creeping feeling of having overlooked something. I walked up to it, heart thudding in my chest, and tried the handle. It was locked. Confused, I stood there, staring at it. I had no memory of seeing this door when I moved in, but it had to have been here, right? I'd rented the place from the landlord, and everything was supposed to be settled. I could feel my mind racing, trying to come up with an explanation, but nothing made sense. My curiosity got the better of me. I called the landlord, but there was no answer. I texted, but still nothing. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the door had always been there and I had simply never noticed. But as I stood in front of it, something about it made my skin crawl. The next morning, I decided to investigate. The door was still there, standing like a forgotten relic in the hallway. I tried the handle again, still locked, but this time, something had changed. There was a faint scratch on the door, almost as though someone had tried to claw their way out. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't want to admit it, but something was deeply wrong. I decided to let it go, to ignore it. But as the days went by, the door seemed to pull at my attention. I couldn't stop thinking about it, the way it loomed in the hallway, always waiting. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the door in my mind. The sound of faint whispering seemed to drift through the walls, just out of reach. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Old buildings made strange noises. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the building creaking. The next evening, after what felt like hours of staring at the door, I decided I had to know what was behind it. I found an old hairpin in my drawer and used it to pick the lock. The sound of the tumblers shifting was louder than I expected, and when the door finally clicked open, I almost felt relieved. What I found wasn't what I had imagined. The room was tiny, only about the size of a closet, and completely dark. I stepped in cautiously, my feet crunching on the wooden floor. The air inside felt stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in places, and there was a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, its wire frayed. But the strangest thing was the mirror. It was large, almost too large for the small room. It stood against the far wall, framed in dark wood, its surface slightly fogged. I stepped closer, hesitant, unsure of what to expect. The reflection that stared back at me was wrong. My face was distorted, twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. My eyes were wide, too wide, and my mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. The more I stared, the more the reflection seemed to move on its own, as though it had a life of its own. My own hands reached out, but the reflection didn't mirror me. It reached for the glass as if trying to claw its way out. I stumbled back in horror, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was racing, and I could barely breathe. I had to get out, had to leave, but the hallway felt like it was closing in on me. The whispering was louder now, unmistakable, as if something, or someone, was waiting just behind the walls. I ran for the front door, but when I turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I spun around, panicked, and that's when I saw it. The door at the end of the hallway, the one I had locked, was wide open. I didn't know how. I didn't know why, but I couldn't look away. The mirror was now reflecting the hallway, and there, in the reflection, was the thing from the other side, the thing with my face. Its smile grew wider. Its eyes, wider still. It was closer now, its hand pressed against the glass, reaching out toward me. I didn't look back as I ran through the hall, feeling the walls close in, the door now impossibly far away. The door that should have been locked. The door I had just opened. And then, just as I thought I had escaped, the whispering stopped. There was no more sound. When I turned around, the door was gone. The hallway was empty. The apartment, once familiar, was now completely silent. I don't know how I ended up leaving. Maybe I ran. Maybe I didn't. But I know one thing for sure. I've never gone back, and I never will, because some doors should never be opened. It was late, later than I'd meant to be, but the train station was still bustling with people. My business trip had run long, and I was thankful to finally be on my way home. I'd missed the last express train, but a local train was still scheduled to leave in 30 minutes, and I didn't mind the extra time. The station had a strange, outdated feel to it, as though it hadn't been renovated in decades. The old-fashioned signs and the flickering fluorescent lights gave it an eerie atmosphere, but I brushed it off. There weren't many people around now, just a few stragglers milling about. As I stood on the platform, I noticed a man sitting alone on one of the benches. He was dressed strangely, like someone out of a different time. A long overcoat, a scarf tucked under his chin, and his hair slicked back with a shine that almost seemed unnatural. I wasn't sure why, but he made me uneasy. The train arrived. On schedule, the old tracks creaking under the weight of the train's approach. I climbed aboard, looking for an empty seat. The car was mostly empty, save for a few passengers scattered throughout. I chose a seat by the window and settled in, gazing out at the dark, rainy night. The train lurched forward, and I watched the city lights blur as we sped into the countryside. The dim, overhead lights flickered now and then, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then I noticed something strange, a shadow crossing the aisle. I glanced up, expecting to see the conductor, but it was the man from the station. He had somehow moved from the platform to the train without me noticing. He didn't speak to anyone. Instead, he slowly made his way down the aisle, his eyes scanning the passengers. When he reached me, he stopped. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there staring. "Excuse me," I said, trying to get his attention. "Is there something you need?" His lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The train only takes you so far," he muttered, then walked away. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong, but I couldn't place it. I tried to shake off the feeling, but the train seemed to grow colder, quieter. The other passengers had become oddly still, their faces expressionless. The man was now sitting in a seat at the end of the car, his gaze fixed forward, not moving. The hours passed, and the further we traveled, the more unsettling it became. The train's motion grew erratic, rocking as though it were being pushed by some unseen force. Suddenly, the train jolted violently, causing me to grip the armrests. The lights flickered, then went out completely. We were plunged into darkness. The man's voice broke the silence, calm and cold. "We're almost there." I felt my heartbeat quicken. "Where is there?" Before I could get an answer, the train screeched to a halt, throwing me forward. The air smelled damp and stale, and when the lights flickered back on, we were no longer moving. We had stopped in the middle of a dark, desolate landscape, nothing but thick fog surrounding the train. I looked around in confusion. The other passengers remained still, unblinking, staring straight ahead. The man stood up, his eyes fixed on me once more. "The journey doesn't end until you understand," he whispered. I stood up, my legs shaking, and made my way toward the door. The platform outside was empty, just an expanse of darkness stretching in all directions. I pulled the door open, but the man's voice stopped me. "You can't leave, not yet." I turned to face him, panic rising in my chest. "Why? What is this?" "The train only brings you to the threshold," he said, his smile widening. "But you're already where you need to be." Before I could respond, he vanished into the fog, disappearing without a trace. I tried to open the door again, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, the handle remained stuck. The train felt as though it were closing in on me, and the other passengers had begun to shift, their eyes now focused on me, as though waiting for something. In a panic, I ran to the next car, but it was the same. No exit, only endless rows of passengers staring ahead, unblinking. I banged on the windows, but the fog outside swallowed everything. I felt trapped, suffocated, and then I heard it. A low, distant sound like a whistle. The man appeared again, standing outside the train, his hand pressed against the glass. "You've already missed the last stop," he said, his voice like a low hum in the cold air. With that, the train lurched forward again, moving slowly, the fog never lifting. I realized with a cold dread settling in my gut that this was no ordinary ride. The man wasn't just a passenger, he was the conductor, and I was no longer sure if I was on my way home at all. The train moved on, the eerie landscape stretching forever into the void, and I knew deep down that I would never reach my destination. I had already crossed the point where the journey ends, but there was no way back. It was supposed to be a simple stop, just a small town on the way to my destination, nothing more. I had never heard of it, but the GPS suggested I take the detour. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the road, and I was running, low on gas. I drove into a sleepy town, the streets unusually empty. The only sign of life was a small diner with a flickering neon sign, "Open." I pulled in and parked. The diner's windows were clouded, but I could make out the silhouette of an elderly woman behind the counter. I stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, but the air felt heavy, still. It was almost too quiet. The woman greeted me with a faint smile, her eyes unnervingly focused. "First time in town?" she asked, her voice scratchy. "Yeah," I replied. "Just passing through." She nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. She poured me a cup of coffee without asking and set it down on the counter. The diner was old, the kind of place that seemed frozen in time. There were no other customers, and the place felt deserted. My unease grew as I looked around, noticing that the walls were lined with photographs of the town over the years, some of which seemed to date back decades. "Why is it so quiet here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. The woman's eyes flickered toward the window. "When the lanterns turn on, you won't see anyone else. It's best to stay inside when that happens." Her words sent a chill through me. "Lanterns?" She pointed outside. I followed her gaze. There, down the street, were old-fashioned red lanterns hanging from the street posts, their light casting an eerie glow on the deserted road. "They come on at nightfall," she continued, her voice lower, now as if sharing a secret. "When they light, it's too late to leave." I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I glanced at the clock. Almost 6. The sun was almost gone. The quiet outside felt unsettling. I asked, "What do you mean? What happens if I leave now?" But before she could answer, a man entered the diner. He was tall, wearing a long coat, and his eyes were shadowed. He sat down at the booth in the corner without a word, staring out the window, where the lanterns were now starting to flicker on one by one. The woman didn't speak again. She only stared at the man for a moment, then turned back to me with a knowing smile. "It's too late now," she whispered. I felt the door behind me slam shut without any warning. I jumped, my pulse quickening. When I turned back to the woman, she was gone, and the man at the booth was watching me. I stood up, heart racing. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the air had solidified around it, holding it shut. Panic surged through me. The man slowly stood and walked toward me, his eyes empty, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're part of it now," he said, his voice flat. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My hand grasped the door handle, but it was still useless. Then I turned back to the man who was standing directly in front of me now. His lantern glowed black in his hand, its flame flickering like something unnatural. Suddenly, the lights in the diner dimmed. The air grew colder, and the only sound I could hear was the low hum of the lantern's flame. It was drawing closer. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the worn floorboards, and tried the door again. It gave way with a squeal of resistance. I stepped outside into the night, the fog thick around me, swallowing the streets. The red lanterns were now burning brighter, casting a sinister glow across the town. I turned to look at the diner, but the windows were black, the door shut tight. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't look back as I ran to my car and drove as fast as I could. When I glanced in my rearview mirror, I saw the red lanterns still glowing faintly in the distance. And then, nothing but empty roads. I haven't gone back to that town, but sometimes when the night is particularly still, I think I can still see those lanterns flickering in my mirror, waiting. The invitation came in the form of an email, addressed to me from someone I didn't know. It was plain and brief. "You've been selected for an exclusive stay in one of our experimental rental homes. No cost, just your thoughts afterward." It sounded ridiculous, but curiosity won. A free weekend in a fancy house didn't sound bad. The location was remote, nestled in the countryside with no neighbors for miles. When I arrived, I was stunned. The house was ultra-modern, all glass, and steel, sitting in the middle of an empty field. The design felt too perfect, cold, like it wasn't meant for anyone to live in. Inside, it was even stranger. The furniture was sparse, each piece looking more like art than something practical. The only color in the entire house came from a red door on the ground floor, tucked into the far corner of the living room. The door didn't belong. Everything else in the house was sleek and minimalist, but this door looked ancient. Chipped wood, rusted hinges. I pulled the handle, but it was locked. I spent the first night trying to relax, but the silence was oppressive. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the faint hum of electricity from the house itself. I told myself it was fine, but when the power flickered at midnight, my nerves began to fray. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easily. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of faint knocking. At first, I thought it was coming from the front door, but as I got out of bed, I realized it was coming from below me. The red door. The sound was rhythmic, steady, like someone tapping with a knuckle. My heart pounded as I crept down the stairs. The house was pitch black except for the faint glow from the red door. I hadn't noticed it gave off light before. As I approached, the knocking stopped. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, unsure what to do. Then, without warning, it unlocked itself. The latch clicked loudly in the silence and the door creaked open just a crack. I froze. Part of me wanted to slam it shut and run, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pulled the door open all the way. A narrow staircase led down into darkness. The air that drifted up was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of mildew. The staircase didn't match the house. It was old stone, uneven and crumbling, like it belonged to another century. Against my better judgment, I stepped onto the first stair. Then the second. The light from my phone barely pierced the shadows as I descended. The deeper I went, the colder it became. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a small room. The walls were made of stone, covered in strange, jagged carvings that didn't look like any language I'd ever seen. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair. On the chair sat a box, and on top of the box was a note written in shaky handwriting. "Don't look behind you." My breath caught. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Against every instinct, I shined my light on the box. It was old, the wood splintered and warped, and there was no lid, just an empty, gaping hole. Then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound, like something dragging across stone coming from behind me. I didn't turn around. My heart was hammering so loudly I could barely think. The scraping grew louder, closer, accompanied by a faint, wet breathing. The note had said not to look, and I wasn't about to find out why. I bolted. I ran up the stairs, the sound of something following close behind. The air grew colder with every step. I could feel its presence, something towering and wrong, but I didn't look back. When I reached the top, I slammed the red door shut and pressed my back against it, gasping for air. The house was silent again, as if nothing had happened. Didn't stay another minute. I grabbed my bag and fled, not bothering to lock the door behind me. As I sped down the empty road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The house stood dark and silent in the distance, but the red door was open again, glowing faintly in the night. I don't know what was in that basement, and I never will. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear faint knocking, steady and rhythmic, coming from somewhere below. It was an old house, a sprawling, creaky thing with layers of history that none of us fully understood. My sister, Mia, and I had inherited it after our great-aunt passed away, and we had no real plan for what to do with it. It wasn't the kind of house you just sold. There was too much family history, too many memories embedded in the wood, in the walls. We decided to clean it up, maybe even fix it up, and make it into a summer getaway. The first night we spent there, I could hardly sleep. The house was far too quiet, far too large for just the two of us. The silence seemed to breathe, and I could hear every creak, every groan of the house settling. Mia had already fallen asleep, but I lay awake in the darkness, listening to the strange sounds that filled the empty spaces. The next morning, while unpacking some of our aunt's old things in the attic, I came across a large, ornate mirror. It was an antique, with a heavy wooden frame carved with intricate patterns I couldn't quite make out in the dust and dim light. At first, I thought nothing of it, but when I set it down against the wall, I had a strange feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't explain it. Something about the mirror felt alive, like it was watching me. "Hey, Mia, look at this," I called down the stairs. She came up, her face lighting up at the sight of the mirror. "That's beautiful. Let's clean it off and put it somewhere." We spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the attic, moving boxes, and getting the house in order. But when it came time for bed, I found it hard to shake the unease the mirror had left me with. Mia was already asleep in the room across the hall, but I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. I kept thinking about the mirror. I kept thinking about its reflection. I told myself it was nothing, But when I passed by the hallway on my way to the kitchen, I glanced at the mirror again, and this time, something was different. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light. The reflection was distorted in the dark, but there, just behind my shoulder, I could swear I saw a figure. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. I convinced myself it was my imagination, just the shadows playing tricks. But when I returned to my room, the unease wouldn't leave. I kept hearing whispers, faint, almost like they were coming from the other side of the wall. I pressed my ear to the door, but there was nothing, just the hum of the house. I tried to sleep, but the whispers grew louder. Then I heard something else, a soft knock at my door. "Mia," I called, my voice shaking. There was no answer. The knock came again, louder this time. I scrambled out of bed, opening the door, but the hallway was empty. Confused and growing more anxious, I rushed to the attic. The mirror was still there, leaning against the wall, reflecting nothing but the empty room. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that's when I saw it. A shadow moved in the reflection. A figure stood behind me, its face just out of view. I turned, quickly, but there was nothing there. My heart raced as I stared at the mirror. The figure was still there, standing perfectly still in the reflection, just behind me, but when I looked, no one was in the room with me. The reflection started to shift. Slowly, the figure moved, its head tilting toward me, its eyes staring into mine. I froze, unable to look away. The figure's mouth curled into a smile that was not a smile. "Get out," it whispered, the voice coming from the reflection but somehow inside my head. I backed away from the mirror, my pulse pounding in my ears. The reflection didn't move. It stayed frozen, watching me. But as I reached the door, I heard it again. The knock. I rushed back to my room, closing the door behind me and locking it. But the whispers kept coming, louder this time, accompanied by the soft sound of footsteps moving just outside my door. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The next morning, I couldn't find Mia. I searched the entire house, calling out for her, but she was gone. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the slow ticking of an old clock in the hallway. I finally checked the attic again. The mirror was gone. I looked around, frantic, but there was no sign of Mia. Only the heavy silence pressing in on me. Then I saw it, the reflection, now hanging on the wall. There she was, standing in front of the mirror, looking directly at me. Her eyes were wide with terror, but her lips moved slowly. "Don't trust the reflection," she whispered. I turned and ran, but no matter where I went in the house, I could hear the whispers. I never found Mia again. I moved out of the house, leaving everything behind, but the whispers still haunt me. And every time I pass a mirror, I can't help but wonder, is she watching me, trapped inside? Or is it something else, something that's been there all along? It was late afternoon when we arrived. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the overgrown paths and broken fountains of the abandoned garden. The air was thick with the scent of decay and wildflowers gone wild. My friends and I had stumbled upon it while exploring the outskirts of an old, forgotten town. No one had lived there for years, yet the garden still retained its eerie beauty. The wrought iron gate, heavily rusted, stood slightly ajar, creaking softly with every gust of wind. Beyond it, the garden spread out, a tangled mess of weeds, twisted trees, and stone statues half buried in moss. It was a place long forgotten by time, untouched by human hands for decades. We stepped inside, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only sound. As we walked along the gravel paths, the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. The air grew colder with every step, and the once tranquil atmosphere took on a sinister edge. There were no birds, no animals, just an unnatural silence, as though the garden itself was holding its breath. "Let's split up," Jessica said, always eager for adventure. "We'll cover more ground." "Are you crazy?" Mark snapped, his voice low and uneasy. "We don't know what's in here." "It's fine," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll stick together for now." But curiosity pushed us forward. We explored the garden's depths, deeper than we ever intended. The statues lining the paths were disturbing, weathered faces twisted into grotesque expressions, some with hollow eyes where stone had crumbled away. Their silent stares followed us wherever we went. Suddenly, we stumbled upon a patch of dirt where nothing grew. It was unnatural, completely barren except for a single stone pedestal, weathered by time. Resting atop it was an open book bound. In dark leather, its pages yellowed and torn. "We can't just leave it here," Jessica said, reaching for the book. "It might be important." "No," Mark said sharply. "We shouldn't touch it." But Jessica had already lifted it. The weight felt wrong, too heavy for its size, and the moment her fingers brushed the pages, a cold shiver ran down her spine. The words inside were cryptic and ancient, detailing rituals and symbols that sent an uneasy feeling crawling through her mind. The whispers started then, a soft, distant murmur in the corners of our ears. At first, it was just a hum, but it grew louder with each passing second. The statues around us seemed to move slightly, their stone eyes twitching with life. The feeling that we were no longer alone was undeniable. "Put it down," Mark urged, grabbing Jessica's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But as we hurried to move away, the wind picked up suddenly, gusting violently, sending leaves flying. The whispers turned into a cacophony, voices merging into one, screaming in languages we couldn't comprehend. Shadows swirled around us, encroaching from every direction, their forms flickering between human and something far darker. Jessica dropped the book, stumbling backward. Mark grabbed her, pulling her into a run, but the garden seemed to stretch, impossibly. The paths warped, twisting into impossible shapes. We couldn't see the gate anymore, or even where we had entered. The garden was endless, a labyrinth of madness. "Where are we?" Jessica cried, her voice frantic. "Just keep running," I yelled back, but panic had taken hold of us all. The statues began to rise fully, their forms shifting into something grotesque and inhuman. They didn't speak, but their hollow eyes glowed with a malevolent light. They moved toward us silently, their feet barely touching the ground. We were surrounded. Every direction we looked was filled with darkness. The whispers became deafening, a chorus of agony that consumed our senses. Suddenly, a voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the chaos. "Leave!" The statues froze mid-step, their forms twisting back into stone. The wind stilled. The whispers ceased. We stood motionless, unable to breathe, unable to speak, and then, as quickly as it had started, the garden fell into a deathly silence once more. The book lay open on the stone pedestal. The leather was unblemished, the pages blank. Without a word, we turned and ran. The old house had been in our family for generations, sitting alone on the edge of town where the forest began to creep in. It was a place full of memories, both happy and strange, but none of us had ever ventured into the basement. The stories had always been there, whispered between family members in hushed tones, rumors of things unseen, of a door that led to something dark and ancient. It was a rainy evening when my curiosity finally got the better of me. The storm had been brewing all day, and the house seemed quieter than usual. I found myself standing at the basement door, the heavy old wood worn with age. The air was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the warmth of the house above. I hesitated. The tales told of strange noises echoing from the basement. Whispers carried through the narrow gaps, dragging voices that spoke in languages long forgotten. But tonight, something felt different. The silence was absolute. No creaks from the floorboards, no wind rattling the windows. Just stillness. Curiosity outweighed fear. I placed my hand on the brass doorknob and pushed. The door resisted at first, but with a firm shove it swung open into darkness. The staircase leading down was narrow and twisted, illuminated only by the faint glow of my phone's flashlight. Each step echoed louder than I expected, the creaks of the old wood unnerving in the quiet. I descended deeper into the basement, the temperature dropping with every footfall. The walls seemed to close in slightly, the air thickening with a strange energy. At the bottom, I reached the familiar concrete floor, cold and smooth beneath my feet. That's when I saw it. The basement was exactly as I remembered it, but there was something different about the far wall. A door. It was solid, made of metal, and stood out starkly against the old stone. My breath hitched. It wasn't supposed to be there. The basement had always been empty, unfinished, and yet there it stood, ominous and locked tight. I tried the handle, expecting resistance, but it turned easily. The door opened with a slow, heavy creak. Beyond, there was only blackness. Not a typical basement darkness, but something deeper, more suffocating. I hesitated again, the chill biting at my skin. The whispers started as a low hum in the back of my mind, a sound that wasn't quite a voice, but something more primal, more insistent. They whispered names, fragments of words that didn't belong to any language I knew. Despite the fear clawing at my senses, I pushed forward into the darkness. The room was cold, with a faint smell of decay in the air. I could feel the presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting behind that door for a very long time. The whispers grew louder as I moved deeper into the space, surrounding me like a dark tide. They were no longer words, just a maddening, endless hum that seemed to come from within my own mind. My breath hitched, and my pulse quickened with each step. Suddenly, I froze. In the corner of the room, something shifted. A figure, not human, not entirely. Its shape was fluid, shifting between shadow and substance, its outline distorted by the oppressive darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly, red and empty, piercing through the blackness like embers. "Leave," it whispered, its voice hollow and inhuman. "You shouldn't be here." I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The room seemed to tighten around me, the walls closing in further. The entity moved slowly towards me, its form bending unnaturally. "Go," it hissed again. "You will wake them." The panic surged, but I forced myself to turn and climb back toward the door. The whispers escalated, their volume unbearable. "Leave! Leave!" As my hand touched the metal handle once more, the darkness behind me lunged forward, a wave of shadowy tendrils reaching out to grasp my legs. It was a late summer night when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip into the woods. We packed a few essentials, flashlights, snacks, and a blanket, and drove out to a secluded trail far from the nearest town. The air was warm, but it carried a heavy sense of stillness, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. The sun had long since set by the time we parked the car and stepped into the forest. The trail was overgrown, narrow, and winding. Trees loomed above us like dark sentinels, their branches reaching toward the sky in twisted shapes. A constant low hum of insects surrounded us, but as we ventured deeper, that sound began to fade into silence. It was like the woods were swallowing us whole. We joked at first, telling stories about local legends and ghost sightings, trying to shake the growing unease. But the deeper we went, the quieter the forest became, until even our own voices seemed distant. Then we heard it, a faint, rasping breath just beyond our hearing. My friend Hannah stopped mid-step, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Did you hear that?" "Nothing," I said, brushing it off, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was out there, watching us. The trail twisted again, this time leading toward an old, rotted wooden cabin. Its windows were dark, covered with layers of grime, and the front door hung crookedly on its hinges. No one had stepped inside for years. "Let's check it out," James said, grinning nervously. "No way," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "We need to turn back." But curiosity got the better of them, and Hannah pushed open the door. It groaned loudly on its hinges, the sound reverberating through the still woods. Dust floated in the dim light, settling into the thick air. Inside, the cabin was empty, save for a lone, tattered armchair facing the fireplace as though waiting for someone to return. "Let's go," I urged again, but nobody listened. The room seemed colder than before. Shadows stretched across the walls, pooling in corners like dark, shifting pools of ink. We could feel eyes watching us, unseen and omnipresent. Every step we took felt heavier, slower. Suddenly, the breath returned, sharp, ragged, impossibly close. It whispered through the room like a ghost. I turned quickly, my flashlight beam sweeping over the empty space. Nothing but the dust, the fireplace, and the oppressive darkness. Hannah screamed. She had seen something, or someone, in the reflection of the glass in the cabin's broken window. A gaunt face, hollow eyes, and a twisted smile that stretched impossibly wide. "Run!" she shrieked, but it was too late. The door slammed shut behind us with a resounding crash, and the world outside was no longer familiar. The forest had changed. The trees were closer, their twisted branches clawing at the air, and the shadows had grown taller, hunched and moving like grotesque figures. We bolted down the trail, desperate to escape the suffocating woods. But every path seemed to loop back on itself, every direction twisted into darkness. Our flashlights flickered erratically, revealing glimpses of the things lurking just beyond the edge of sight. More faces, more whispers, and more shadows that seemed almost alive. When we finally emerged from the woods, gasping for breath, we found ourselves back at the car. The air was crisp and still, but the forest behind us remained silent, watching. None of us spoke as we drove away. We didn't look back. The GPS had failed hours ago, and the four of us were hopelessly lost. The back roads wound endlessly through unfamiliar woods, the dense trees blotting out the moonlight. What had started as a fun weekend road trip had turned into something else, entirely. A frantic attempt to find our way back to civilization. As the car rolled along the cracked asphalt, a strange fog began to rise. It clung low to the ground, unnervingly thick, swallowing the road behind us. We hadn't passed another car in miles, and the deeper we went, the more the road seemed to deteriorate. Broken pavement, overgrown weeds creeping up the edges, and signs rusted beyond recognition. "Are we even going the right way?" Claire asked from the passenger seat, her voice strained. "I don't know," I admitted. "But turning back won't help. We have to keep going until we hit a main road." The others in the back, Mike and Tara, were unusually quiet. None of Idus said it aloud, but we all felt it. The oppressive weight of the woods pressing in, the silence broken only by the occasional snap of a branch in the darkness. After another hour of driving, we saw a sign. It was old, the paint faded, but it pointed to a town we'd never heard of. Relieved, we decided to follow it. The road narrowed as we continued, the trees growing denser until they seemed to form a tunnel around us. Then, the headlights flickered. "Did you see that?" Claire whispered. Before I could answer, the car stalled. The engine sputtered and died, leaving us in suffocating darkness. I turned the key again, but the car refused to start. Mike groaned from the back seat. "Great. What now?" "We'll check it out," I said, though my voice was far from confident. Claire and I stepped out, the cold air biting at our skin. The fog was thicker now, swirling around our ankles. The forest beyond the road was unnaturally still. No wind, no chirping insects, nothing. As I opened the hood, Claire grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" It was faint at first, a distant humming sound like static on a television. It grew louder, more distinct, until it became clear. A voice, low and guttural, calling out from the woods. "Hello?" Claire called, her voice trembling. I grabbed her hand. "Don't." But then it happened. Shapes began to emerge from the fog. At first, they were faint, like shadows cast by an unseen light. But as they drew closer, I realized they weren't human. Their forms were twisted and wrong, elongated limbs, hollowed faces, and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Claire screamed, and we bolted back to the car. I pounded on the windows. "Mike, Tara, unlock the doors." But when we climbed back, the back seat was empty. Where are they?" Claire stammered. "They were just here," I yelled, panic rising. The shadows surrounded the car now, pressing against the windows. Their faces, if you could call them that, were just inches from the glass, staring in with an unnatural hunger. The car groaned as though the weight of their presence was too much for it to bear. Then, all at once, they vanished. I turned the key in desperation, and the car roared to life. Without thinking, I floored the gas, swerving around the fog and speeding down the road. Claire clutched my arm, tears streaming down her face. "Where's Mike? Where's Tara?" "I don't know," I shouted. The road stretched on, endless and dark. We drove for what felt like hours, the forest never thinning, the fog never lifting. When we finally stopped, the car was nearly out of gas, and there was no sign of any town. We never found Mike or Tara. The police dismissed our story, chalking it up to exhaustion and stress. But Claire and I know the truth. Whatever we saw that night, it wasn't human. And sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I swear I see shapes in the fog, watching, waiting. The house was old. Too old. Its weathered wood stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean. The surrounding trees clawed at the sky, their branches casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. My friends and I had stumbled upon it during a late-night hike, curious and foolish, eager to explore the mystery hidden in the isolation of the wilderness. As we approached the house, the chill in the air grew more pronounced. The windows were dark, their glass cracked and fogged. The daughter creaked on its rusted hinges as we pushed it open, revealing a space that hadn't seen light in decades. Dust covered every surface, and the scent of decay hung heavy in the room. "I don't think we should stay," Emma whispered, her voice shaky. Her flashlight flickered, casting brief moments of light into the shadows. But curiosity pulled us forward. The rooms were small and cramped, filled with forgotten belongings, an old rocking chair, books turned to dust, faded photographs pinned to the walls. There was a sense of abandonment, as though the house itself was mourning its past. In one of the back rooms, we found a trunk. The rusted latch snapped open with a groan, revealing layers of yellowed papers and brittle letters. Most were illegible, but one stood out, a diary, barely held together by fragile string. The pages were stained with ink, but the handwriting was clear, if unsettling. "They come at night," it read. "Not with footsteps. They whisper, and the sound seeps into your mind." We paused, exchanging uneasy glances. "It's just an old story," Liam said, trying to break the tension. "Probably something written by a lonely old woman." But Emma shook her head, her hand trembling as she traced the inked letters. "It feels real." The house seemed to darken around us. The wind howled through broken windows, sending cold drafts through the rooms. Shadows flickered in the corners of our vision, shapes that twisted and disappeared as soon as we tried to focus on them. "We need to get out," Emma urged again, her voice desperate now. "Something isn't right." Suddenly, the whispers. began. Soft, indistinct at first, just the faintest murmur at the edge of hearing. We froze, our breath caught in our throats. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the air, surrounding us. "Leave," they said. "You shouldn't be here." We turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a thunderous crack. No one was near the handle. The windows fogged over, blocking out any light. The shadows deepened, stretching across the room in unnatural ways. "Stay," the whispers hissed. "We know you now." Panic set in. We screamed for help, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. My flashlight flickered wildly before going out completely. The room was pitch black, and the whispers were deafening. They filled the air, suffocating, each one more chilling than the last. "Please," Emma cried, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't mean to come here." The whispers grew into laughter, harsh, cruel laughter that echoed through the house. The shadows seemed to pulse with life, closing in around us. We pressed against the walls, trying to make ourselves disappear, but the darkness was relentless. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the laughter stopped. The whispers quieted to a haunting silence. The air felt heavier. It was late evening when we left the small town behind. The sun had long since set, leaving the horizon a dull orange glow as we drove down the winding country road. The headlights barely cut through the dense trees lining either side, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and pine. Just a few of us had decided on this spontaneous road trip. My best friend Rachel sat beside me in the passenger seat, while our two friends, Ben and Lisa, followed behind in a separate car. The road had been quiet for miles. No other cars, no signs of life. The distant hum of cicadas was the only sound. "It's getting darker," Rachel said, her voice tense. "Maybe we should stop soon." "We're fine," I replied, trying to sound reassuring. "There's a small town up ahead, right?" I checked the GPS again, but the signal had been spotty for the last hour. It kept flashing between bars, as though the road itself was swallowing the signal. I sighed, turning the volume down on the radio. Static hissed, occasionally punctuated by distant whispers I couldn't quite make out. Suddenly, the car jolted slightly. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a stop on the side of the road. "What the hell?" I whispered, looking down at the dashboard. A deep scratch ran along the side of the car, an unnatural, jagged mark. "What was that?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. We both stepped out of the car to inspect the damage. Nothing was visible in the darkness. No branches, no debris, just the scratch. "Must have been a rock or something," I said, though I wasn't convinced. As we stood there, I noticed Ben and Lisa's car pulling up behind us. They were clearly shaken, too. "We saw something," Lisa said quietly, her voice shaking. "On the road. A figure, walking slowly. But there was nothing there when we checked." Rachel and I exchanged a glance, uneasy. The silence seemed to deepen again. The trees seemed to close in, shadows twisting unnaturally as the wind rustled through the leaves. "Let's just keep moving," I urged, though I wasn't sure if that was the right decision. The road ahead was even darker, more isolated. We drove in tense silence, but no matter how far we went, it felt like we were going in circles. The road didn't seem to end. The GPS was completely frozen now, the screen showing a blank map with no roads, no towns, just an endless expanse of black. Every now and then, we caught glimpses of something at the edge of the headlights, a shadow, a silhouette, fleeting and elusive, barely discernible before vanishing completely. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, watching. "Did you see that?" Rachel asked, gripping my arm tightly as we passed a bend. Her voice shook. I didn't need to ask what she was talking about. Every turn, every glance into the rearview mirror was met with unease. Finally, the road straightened out and there was a slight incline ahead. The headlights flickered again as we crested the hill, and that's when we saw it, the figure standing in the middle of the road. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its shape was too tall, too thin, and the features were distorted, lacking a clear face, just an empty, shifting void. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like something inhuman was attempting to walk forward. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The figure loomed closer, stepping toward us. We could feel its presence, almost tangible in the suffocating air. The static on the radio surged louder, an inhuman scream cutting through the noise before fading again into eerie silence. "We have to get out of here," I managed to say, my voice a whisper. My hands were trembling as I put the car in reverse, tires squealing as I sped backward. The figure didn't follow, at least not immediately, but the fear that it was still there, waiting in the darkness, haunted us. We didn't stop until we found a small roadside motel, miles down the highway. The place was no safer. Creaky floors, flickering lights, and an air of oppressive stillness. But we didn't care. We just needed to put distance between us and whatever we saw. To this day, we have no explanation for what happened on that road. The memory haunts us, an endless, silent expanse of darkness and something beyond our understanding. It was a dreary autumn evening when I found myself driving down an isolated country road, the map app on my phone flickering with uncertainty. My friends and I were on a weekend getaway, heading to a supposed abandoned lake house for a bit of adventure. The place was off the grid, miles from any sign of civilization. The closer we got, the more the road twisted through dense, shadowy forests. The sky darkened rapidly, and the air grew cold, biting at our skin through the cracked windows of the old car. The only sound was the distant croaking of frogs echoing through the woods. Finally, we arrived. The lake house sat on the shore, shrouded in mist and overgrown with ivy. It was far more decrepit than we had anticipated. Wooden boards warped, windows shattered, and the entire structure leaning slightly to one side. The front porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. We stepped inside cautiously. The floors creaked beneath our feet, the silence oppressive. Dust covered everything. Furniture, bookshelves, even the walls seemed to absorb sound. Outside, the lake lapped against the shore with a haunting rhythm. "We should have brought flashlights," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. Her phone had no signal, and the dim glow of our dying car lights was the only source of illumination. The others were just as uneasy. We spread out, exploring the house. Upstairs, the air grew colder, and shadows seemed to flicker across the walls. Every sound echoed too loudly. A floorboard snapping beneath a footstep, the rustling of curtains in the faint breeze. In the master bedroom, we found an old photo album resting on a cracked nightstand. Its pages were brittle, revealing faded images of a family long gone. As we flipped through the images, an unsettling pattern emerged. Every photo had a figure in the background, always watching. Their faces blurred, but their eyes followed us no matter where we turned. "It's just an old house," Alex said, but his voice trembled. "Nothing to worry about." Yet, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whispers started, faintly at first, soft voices that whispered things too quiet to make out. Then the sounds grew louder, distorted, and malicious. Footsteps padded just out of sight down the hallways, each step measured and deliberate. "We need to leave," Sarah insisted, panic in her eyes. As we gathered in the living room, the front door slammed shut behind us. It didn't creak, it didn't slow. It slammed violently, sending a jolt through our chests. The windows rattled in their frames, and the room seemed to shrink, suffocating. The whispering voices grew louder now, weaving together into a chorus. Words emerged, sentences. Without meaning, but with an overwhelming sense of menace, each word sent chills down our spines, like claws scraping against bone. "Get out!" they hissed in unison. Our flashlights flickered and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. The house seemed alive, shifting around us, walls closing in, tighter. We stumbled blindly toward the door, only for it to remain locked. The windows were sealed with layers of fog, blocking any light or view of the outside world. Suddenly, from the darkness, a figure appeared in the room. A tall, shadowy silhouette with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It moved slowly toward us, its footsteps dragging across the floor like nails on a chalkboard. "Leave us alone," I screamed, though my voice shook violently. But the figure continued, unrelenting, reaching out with elongated fingers. In the final moments, we fell to the floor, shivering as the whispers turned into a deafening roar, an unbearable symphony of terror, and then everything fell silent. It was a cold, foggy night when my friends and I stumbled upon the hollow. We were driving back from a remote camping trip in the mountains when we got lost. The GPS had stopped working hours ago, and our phones had no signal. The only thing guiding us was the dim headlights of the car, cutting through the dense fog. We had been winding through narrow, overgrown forest roads for what felt like forever when we finally reached a small clearing. An almost perfect circle surrounded by tall trees on all sides. The fog was thicker here, swallowing everything but our headlights. "Let's turn back," Jess said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's something off about this place." "I think we're lost," Matt replied, checking his phone. Again, only to see no bars. "We can't turn back now." We hesitated, but the feeling of being trapped was suffocating. As we moved forward, the hollow grew larger. The trees surrounding it seemed to press inward, leaning toward us as if shielding something hidden within. The ground was soft, covered with a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The quiet was unnatural. No birds chirped. No wind moved through the branches. That's when we saw them. At first, they were shadows, dark shapes flickering in the fog near the edge of the clearing. Human figures, but distorted. Tall and thin, with elongated limbs that moved in unnatural, jerky motions. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just stared. Their eyes were black voids, like empty sockets peering through the fog. "Stay close," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But my friends were frozen, their breaths quick and shallow. A low, hollow moan echoed from within the fog, a sound that didn't seem human. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, twisting and shifting as though the forest itself were breathing. The shapes moved closer, and now we could see more. Hundreds of them, surrounding the hollow. They were no longer shadows. They were people, but twisted, grotesque versions of what humans should be. Their faces contorted into unnatural grins, their bodies lurching forward with unnatural speed. "No! Get in the car!" Matt shouted, dragging Jess and Sarah toward the vehicle. I stumbled after them, but as we reached the car, the engine sputtered and died, leaving us in darkness. The figures were only feet away now. I could hear their breath, shallow, raspy, and their low whispers. Growing louder, more distinct. "Leave us," they hissed, their voices a chorus of distorted syllables. I fumbled with the car keys, trying to start the engine again, but my hands trembled too hard. The shadows reached out, clawing at the windows, their fingers pressed against the glass, impossibly long and skeletal. A loud crack split the silence. One of the figures had smashed the rear window with a sickening thud. Blood dripped from its gnarled hands as it pulled itself inside. "Run!" I screamed, pushing my friends toward the other side of the car. Just as we stumbled out, we heard another crash, this time at the front. Another figure had somehow entered, forcing open the driver's side door. Everything felt surreal, like we were trapped in a nightmare, and there was no escape. The only sound left was the agonized screams. That echoed through the hollow, and then silence. It was a rainy evening when the bus dropped me off at the last stop. I was the only passenger, and the town seemed desolate in the fading light. The rain had picked up, drenching the empty streets in glistening reflections. I glanced around, hoping for some sign of life, but there was nothing, just the sound of the rain on the pavement. The bus rumbled away, leaving me alone at the stop. The old metal shelter creaked in the wind, the rusted roof sagging slightly. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising, given how remote this place was. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no idea how I would get back once night fully set in. A shiver ran down my spine as I looked up and saw the streetlights flicker, dimming to a dull glow. I turned back to the shelter, seeking shelter from the relentless rain. That's when I heard it. A soft, hollow tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from the rain. It was a slow, rhythmic sound, like something was tapping against the glass of the bus shelter. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. Nobody else was there. The tapping continued. My heart pounded harder, and I felt the cold creeping into my bones. I stepped back from the shelter, my gaze darting to the surrounding streets. There was nothing but darkness, no cars, no distant lights, no movement. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. A breath escaped my lips as I exhaled a shaky sigh. I tried to convince myself it had been the rain or my imagination. But then the faint sound returned. Not on the glass this time, but from inside the shelter itself. It wasn't tapping. It was breathing. A low, rasping inhale echoed softly in the confined space. My breath hitched and I backed away, my back hitting the cold metal wall. My legs felt frozen and panic began to surge through me. The shelter seemed to close in around me, the shadows shifting unnaturally, stretching toward me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. Just the rhythmic breathing, steady, uneven. The rain pounded louder now, filling the air with a steady roar, but beneath it, I could still hear the breath. Suddenly, the flickering streetlights shut off, completely, plunging the stop into complete darkness. I couldn't see anything, not even my own hands. The breathing stopped. A terrifying stillness fell over me. Then I heard a voice, a faint, distorted whisper so close to my ear that I could feel its chill. "Why did you stay?" The question reverberated through my skull, deep and echoing. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Panic surged through my body as I tried to scream, but no sound came out. A single drop of rain fell onto my cheek, cold and wet. And then another, and another, until the entire world felt like it was drowning in darkness. The shelter was gone, the bus stop lost to the void. It was late afternoon when we arrived at the edge of the forest, a dense, ancient expanse stretching far beyond what we could see. My friends and I were on a camping trip, seeking adventure away from the familiar world. The air was crisp, and the sun pierced through the canopy in sporadic beams. The forest seemed peaceful, but something felt off. We set up our tents near a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees with gnarled branches. The sounds of nature were soothing at first, the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional call of a bird. But as night approached, a strange stillness settled in. The woods were silent, almost too quiet, as though even the animals avoided the area. As we sat around the fire, eating our meals, we began to notice the whispers. At first, it was faint, a distant murmur like the wind brushing through the leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct. Words we couldn't quite make out, voices we couldn't pinpoint. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's nothing," I said, though my stomach churned with unease. "Just the wind." But the wind didn't explain the chilling way the whispers seemed to form sentences. Phrases like, "you shouldn't have come," and "leave," floated through the air, winding between the trees. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but gradually grew louder. We huddled closer to the fire, trying to ignore the eerie sounds. But no matter how loudly we talked or laughed, the whispers never ceased. They followed us, weaving through the branches, becoming louder with every passing minute. Suddenly, one of my friends, Marcus, shouted, "Stop! Stop whispering!" His voice echoed through the still night. The whispers paused, and for a moment, the woods felt utterly silent. But then they came back, closer now, more desperate. They weren't just voices anymore. They were inhuman, guttural, almost like something wrong. I scrambled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trees loomed, their twisted shapes casting unnaturally long shadows. The whispers became screams, not of rage or anger, but of despair, a haunting chorus of agony and sorrow that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The fire flickered violently, almost dying out as though being consumed by the darkness. Panic surged through us. Emily screamed, dropping her belongings as we rushed toward the tents. We couldn't run. Our feet seemed rooted to the ground. The whispers intensified into deafening howls, and something slithered through the edges of the light, dark shapes twisting in and out of view. The forest seemed alive. Its branches stretched, its roots pulling at the earth as though reaching for something hidden. I turned back to the clearing, gasping for breath, and saw it, a silhouette, pale and gaunt, standing just beyond the edge of the light. Its eyes were hollow, voids of blackness staring into my soul. "Leave," it hissed, and its voice was not human, not animal, something far worse. It wasn't a sound at all, but a presence, a force so malevolent it tore through the very fabric of reality. A blinding light erupted from my flashlight as I screamed, and in that moment of pure terror, everything vanished. When I awoke, the fire had gone out. My friends were gone. The whispers still echo in my mind. It started on a lonely highway, the kind where the horizon stretches forever, and the stars above are brighter than the taillights in front of you. I'd been driving for hours that night, making my way home after a weekend visit with friends. The radio was off, my phone was dead, and the only sound was the low hum of the tires on asphalt. Somewhere around mile marker 116, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. They were distant at first, faint pinpricks on the horizon, but as I glanced back, they seemed to be closing in faster than they should. A little too fast. I kept driving, telling myself it was probably just someone speeding. But the headlights grew brighter and brighter until they were nearly blinding, tailing me aggressively. My pulse quickened as the car behind me swerved slightly as if trying to pass, then fell back, only to repeat the motion seconds later. I tapped my brakes lightly, hoping they'd back off, but they didn't. Instead, their car pulled up beside me, matching my speed. Through my peripheral vision, I could see the vehicle, a black sedan, its windows dark and impossible to see through. I glanced over, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver, but there was no one inside. The steering wheel moved on its own, the car swerving closer to mine. My heart pounded as I gripped the wheel tighter, accelerating in a panic. The black sedan followed, its engine roaring louder than my own. "Leave me alone," I yelled, though no one could hear me. Suddenly, the sedan shot forward, cutting me off and forcing me to slam on the brakes. My car skidded, tires screeching, as I came to a halt in the middle of the highway. The black sedan idled in front of me for a moment, its taillights glowing like red eyes in the darkness. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it sped off into the distance, disappearing into the night. I sat there for a moment, my chest heaving, trying to collect myself. The highway was empty again, as if nothing had happened. I checked the time on the dashboard. It was just past 1 a.m. I told myself it was over, just some kind of bizarre road rage incident. Shaking, I pulled back onto the road and continued, driving. A few miles later, I saw something in the distance. My stomach dropped as I realized it was the black sedan, parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. I slowed instinctively, unsure of what to do. As I passed, I craned my neck to look inside the car. It was empty. No driver, no passengers, nothing. I didn't wait to figure it out. My foot slammed on the gas, the car roaring as I sped away. But the moment I looked in my rearview mirror, the headlights were back. They had appeared from nowhere, closer than before, and they were gaining on me fast. The next few minutes were a blur of panic. I weaved in and out of lanes, trying to lose the car, but it was relentless, always inches behind me. My speedometer climbed past 90, then 100, the road a black ribbon stretching endlessly ahead. Then, without warning, the headlights vanished. Let out a shaky breath, thinking it was finally over, but I was wrong. The air in my car turned ice cold, my breath visible in the sudden chill. A foul smell filled the cabin, like burnt rubber and decay. My radio, though it was off, began to hiss with static. "Why are you running?" A voice crackled through the speakers, low, guttural, and not human. I froze, my hands trembling on the wheel. The voice came again, louder this time. "You can't escape." My rearview mirror showed something I'll never forget. A shadowy figure sitting in my back seat, its face obscured, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I swerved violently, nearly losing control of the car. When I looked back, it was gone. The highway stretched on, empty and endless. I drove for hours, afraid to stop, afraid to look anywhere but straight ahead. When I finally reached the next town, I pulled into a gas station and stumbled out of the car, shaking. The attendant looked up from the counter, startled by my appearance. "Rough night?" he asked. I nodded, too rattled to explain. As I turned back to the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the dusty rear window, someone, or something, had written a single word from the inside. "Soon." It was just another forgotten warehouse, hidden away in the industrial part of town. Rusted metal walls, shattered windows, and a reputation for being haunted by whispers. Nothing unusual for a place like this. I was a paranormal investigator, drawn by the stories of strange occurrences that had plagued the building for years. My team, 4 of us, stepped inside, armed with cameras, EMF meters, and a thirst for the truth. The building had a heavy, oppressive atmosphere from the moment we entered. Dust motes floated through the dim light, settling into layers on the floor like some forgotten graveyard. The floorboards groaned beneath our steps, and every sound amplified unnaturally. The whispers, we were told, had only gotten louder over time. Murmurs of lost souls trapped within the walls. "Stay close," I warned, my voice steady despite the unease creeping into my chest. The air was thick with moisture, colder than it should have been for a building left unused. The rusted machinery in the far corner creaked faintly, as if it were alive, its wheels turning for no one. We moved deeper into the warehouse. The farther we went, the more things felt off. Our equipment buzzed erratically, EMF readings spiking randomly and the cameras capturing flashes of movement that weren't there when we reviewed the footage later. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder. Soft, agonizing voices chanting in unison, echoing from the shadows. The sound was unsettling, though no matter how much we tried to make sense of it, no clear words emerged, just fragmented syllables, endless and haunting. "Who are you?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. She was the newest member of the team, and clearly the most affected by the overwhelming atmosphere. But there was no response, just more whispers. Louder this time, closer. I shone my flashlight down a corridor, revealing a door ajar at the end, pulsating with faint, unnatural light. It wasn't our equipment malfunctioning. This light radiated from the shadows as if something inside was calling out to us. "Let's check it," I said cautiously, motioning for the group to follow. The air grew colder with each step toward the doorway. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a choir of sorrowful voices clawing their way into our minds. The light pulsated brighter, too bright, and the moment we crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted further. Inside, the room was unlike anything we'd encountered. Bookshelves lined the walls, but they were empty. Barren wood with nothing to show. The center of the room held a circular stone table, ancient symbols etched into its surface, glowing faintly beneath the strange light. Around the table stood figures, shadowy, human-like shapes with no faces, just voids where eyes should be. They turned toward us as one, their murmuring voices intensifying. It was impossible to make out what they were saying, but their presence was overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at us to run, but our bodies felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking, reaching for the camera. One of the shadow figures stepped closer. It didn't have feet, just tendrils of darkness curling from where they should have been. A breath escaped from the void where its face should have been, whispering directly into my ear. "Bound," it whispered, "bound to this place." Then everything went black. The building had been empty for years, a relic of a bygone era. My friend Kate and I had rented the attic apartment for a month to escape the city, seeking peace and solitude. The place had a certain charm: wooden beams, old creaking floors, and tall windows that overlooked a quiet street. At first, everything seemed fine. The mornings were calm, with the sun filtering through dust-filled air. But as the days passed, strange occurrences began to surface. Small things at first: a door closing by itself, shadows flickering across the room when no one else was moving. We attributed them to the creaking old house settling, chalking it up to the creaky floorboards and drafty windows. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we heard a soft tapping. Repeated, deliberate. Kate opened the door to check, but no one was there. The hallway was empty. "I swear," Kate whispered, "someone was knocking." "We're just being paranoid," I said, trying to calm her nerves. "It's an old place. Noise travels." But that night, the tapping returned, this time louder. It came from the attic door itself. The sound echoed through the small apartment, making the walls seem alive. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. No response. Kate had gone to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting on the other side. The following days only intensified the strange occurrences. At night, the temperature dropped unnaturally low. The old radiator whistled with a low, unsettling hum, while the sound of footsteps seemed to walk across the attic floor, light, hesitant, as if something was pacing back and forth. One afternoon, I decided to investigate further. Kate was out running errands and the apartment was silent. I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, the attic was in darkness. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. I flicked on my flashlight, revealing a dusty, sparsely furnished room. Furniture was draped in white sheets, and the only sound was my breathing. The walls were lined with old photos, hundreds of them. Faces stared back at me, some smiling, some hauntingly vacant. But what disturbed me most was that the eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room. The tapping started again, louder, from inside the room. I froze. "Kate?" I called out, but there was no response. I pressed forward, lifting one of the sheets covering a chair. Beneath it sat an old antique camera, its lens fixed towards the far wall. Dust coated the lens, but when I moved closer, the faint image of a face appeared, one I couldn't recognize. The tapping grew louder, erratic. The air grew colder, and I felt a pressure against my chest, an unseen weight, as though something was pushing down on me. I turned to leave, but as I opened the door, it slammed shut behind me. The room flickered in and out of sight, shadows dancing across the floor, and then I saw it, a figure, standing in the corner, its face hidden beneath. A tattered hood, I screamed, unable to move. The figure raised its hand, revealing dark, lifeless eyes beneath the hood. The tapping stopped. Suddenly, the attic door burst open and Kate rushed in. "What's happening?" she cried. The figure vanished into the shadows, and the attic was still once more. What was that?" I stammered, my voice shaking. "I don't know," Kate said, her eyes wide. "But we need to get out of here." We left the apartment, leaving the door wide open behind us. The strange presence never returned, but to this day, I can't forget the sound of that tapping, its rhythm echoing in my mind. Last winter, my friends and I rented a remote lodge in the mountains. It was meant to be a relaxing getaway, just snowboarding, hot cocoa, and the crackling warmth of a fireplace. The lodge was nestled deep in the forest, far from any other people, and the snowstorm that hit on the first night made sure we were completely cut off. The place was massive, 3 stories tall with creaky wooden floors, dark hallways, and antique furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The first night was cozy. We sat by the fire, played board games, and told ghost stories. But as the storm raged outside, something started to feel wrong. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming, on a window. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a branch hitting the glass in the wind. But when I checked, there was no branch, and the window was perfectly still. The next morning, my friend Claire said she'd heard footsteps in the hallway during the night. They were slow, like someone was pacing, she said, laughing nervously. We joked about the lodge being haunted, but her unease stuck with me. That evening, the power went out. It wasn't surprising, given the storm, but the timing felt off. The fireplace was still roaring, so we gathered around it, using flashlights and lanterns to light the room. The howling wind outside made the old house groan and creak like it was alive. While we sat there, we heard a loud thud upstairs. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was deliberate, like something heavy had been dropped. We all froze, staring at each other. "What was that?" Ethan whispered. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to keep everyone calm. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Another sound followed, this one sharper, a dragging noise like furniture being pulled across the floor. It came from the 3rd floor, the part of the house we hadn't explored yet. Against my better judgment, we decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights, we climbed the narrow, creaking staircase to the 3rd floor. The air was colder up there, and the hallways felt narrower, the shadows darker. We checked every room, old bedrooms, storage spaces, but they were all empty. Finally, we reached the last door, at the very end of the hall. It was locked. "Let's just go back downstairs," Claire pleaded, but Ethan was already fiddling with the doorknob. With a loud snap, the lock gave way, and the door creaked open. Inside was a small room, bare except for a single wooden chair in the center. On the floor, around the chair, were deep scratches, as if it had been dragged back and forth for years. The air smelled foul, like rotting wood and mildew. On the far wall was a mirror, cracked and dusty. As we stepped inside, our flashlight beams bounced off the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw something move inside the reflection. Something that wasn't us. "Do you see that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. We stared at the mirror. The room behind us was empty, but in the reflection there was a figure sitting in the chair. It was pale, hunched, and facing away from us. Ethan shone his flashlight directly at the chair. It was empty. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, like it had been slammed by an unseen hand. The mirror's reflection shifted. The figure stood up, slowly turning to face us. Its face was blank, featureless, yet its presence was overwhelming. It stepped closer in the reflection, though nothing moved in the room. Then the glass shattered. We screamed, bolting for the door. It wouldn't budge. The air grew icy and the walls seemed to close in. Behind us, I heard the faint sound of footsteps. Soft, At first, then heavier, faster, coming straight toward us. Just as the door finally gave way, the room plunged into silence. We stumbled back down the stairs, hearts racing. No one spoke for the rest of the night, and we left the lodge the moment the storm cleared. I don't know what we saw in that mirror, or why it was there. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear the faint sound of a chair dragging across the floor. It was a strange dare to begin with. Spend one night in the abandoned watch factory on the edge of town. The place had been shut down decades ago after a fire gutted most of the interior, leaving it a hollow shell of its former self. Locals avoided it, claiming the place was cursed, but I never believed in that kind of thing, and I wasn't about to back out in front of my friends. The factory loomed in the moonlight, its towering smokestacks reaching into the night sky. Broken windows stared down at me like empty eyes, and the faint smell of soot still lingered, even after all these years. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I stepped inside. The air inside was colder than I expected, heavy and still. My footsteps echoed loudly in the cavernous space as I wandered through rows of rusted machinery. Pieces of old watches lay scattered across the floor, tiny gears, broken faces, cracked glass. The walls were scorched black in places, and the ceiling above was an intricate lattice of exposed beams and metal. I aimed my flashlight at an old clock mounted on the far wall. It was frozen in time. The hands stuck at precisely 2:17. Something about it made me uneasy. I turned away, heading deeper into the factory. As I explored, strange things began to happen. First, it was the sounds, soft metallic clicks, like gears turning, echoing through the empty space. Then, faint whispers, too distant to make out but unmistakably human. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding, scanning the room with my flashlight. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The sound echoed back at me, distorted and hollow. The whispers stopped. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. I pressed on, trying to ignore the rising dread. In one corner of the factory, I found a small office, its door hanging off the hinges. Inside, a desk sat covered in dust, an old ledger open to a page filled with unreadable scribbles. On the wall behind the desk was another clock, identical to the one I'd seen earlier. Its hands were also frozen at 2:17. I took a step back, the hair on my neck standing on end. That was when I heard it, a faint ticking sound, growing louder. It wasn't coming from the office, but from somewhere deeper in the factory. The sound pulled me forward, almost against my will. As I moved closer, the ticking grew faster, more frantic. My flashlight began to flicker, the beam cutting in and out. I stumbled into a large, open room, my eyes widening at what I saw. Hundreds of clocks lined the walls, each one different in shape and size. Some were ancient, their faces worn and cracked, while others looked pristine, untouched by time. But they all had one thing in common. Their hands were frozen at 2:17. The ticking sound surrounded me now, deafening, though none of the clocks were moving. My flashlight died completely, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, its weak glow the only light left. Then I saw it, something moving between the clocks. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It moved with jerky mechanical precision, its head swiveling toward me. Two glowing orbs where its eyes should have been fixed on me. Unblinking, the figure stepped closer, its movements accompanied by the sound of grinding gears. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as it reached out with a hand made of twisted metal. Suddenly, all the clocks in the room began to chime at once, their discordant tones echoing through the factory. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony that made my ears ring. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if listening. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The clocks stopped chiming. The room fell silent once more. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, tripping over debris, my phone's light bouncing wildly. When I finally burst out of the factory and into the cold night air, I collapsed, gasping for breath. The next day, I returned with my friends, determined to prove what I'd seen. But when we entered the factory, the clocks were gone. The walls were bare and the room was empty. Only one thing remained: my flashlight lying on the floor where I'd dropped it. The beam still pointed at the wall, and etched into the scorched brick were the words, "Time belongs to us." It had been years since anyone had dared venture near the old well at the edge of town. The stories surrounding it were whispered among the locals. Tales of strange sounds, vanished hikers, and eerie lights that flickered in the dead of night. Most people avoided the well, not out of fear, but out of respect for the ominous legends. But curiosity got the better of me. One late autumn evening, after hearing so many eerie tales, I decided to visit the well alone. My friends had all warned me not to go, but I couldn't resist. The town's ancient history called to me, and the thought of uncovering some forgotten mystery was too tempting. The path to the well was overgrown, hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves and twisted roots. Darkness cloaked the forest, the trees leaning in like they had stories to tell. It was cold, so cold that even my breath formed thick clouds in the air. The faint glimmer of the well came into view as I pushed my way through the underbrush. Ikibauchi. Well itself was old, crumbling stone with a rusted metal bucket sitting awkwardly in its center. The air felt heavy, unnatural, a sense of dread wrapping around my chest. A dim, flickering lantern hung from the well's side, casting strange shadows that twisted unnaturally in the dark. I set my flashlight on the ground and leaned in close to inspect it. The hole was deep, much deeper than it should have been. The sound of dripping water echoed from the bottom, a slow, monotonous drip that made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the well. It came from behind me, from deeper within the woods. It was a woman's voice, soft yet chilling, almost melodic. She was saying something, but the words were indistinct, like they were spoken in a language, lost to time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Silence. I turned back toward the well, gripping my flashlight tightly. The chill deepened and the shadows seemed to shift once again, moving closer, circling the well. There was something unsettling about the way they moved, not driven by wind or natural causes. The lantern flickered harder, its flame sputtering as if something unseen was feeding on it. I reached down to retrieve my flashlight, but as my hand brushed the cold metal, I saw it. Faces, hundreds of them, distorted and gray, pressed against the surface of the water at the bottom of the well. The faces were crying. Silent tears slid down their features, blending into the dark water. Their mouths were twisted in expressions of pain and longing, and their eyes, oh their eyes, hollow, empty, and searching. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, snapping the silence. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me now, voices overlapping and blending into a terrifying symphony of sorrow. I could hear them pleading, crying out, voices from the well, calling for something I couldn't understand. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. "No," I whispered, though my voice trembled. I didn't realize how far I had retreated until my back hit the rough bark of a tree. The shadows closed in, their form no longer shapes, but human-like figures. Long, gaunt, with hollow faces and lifeless eyes. Their fingers reached out, elongated and grotesque, dragging across the surface of the well, clawing toward me. "Please," I begged, lifting the flashlight again. The beam cut through the darkness, pushing them back, but they came closer as if drawn to the light. "Leave!" I screamed, feeling my legs give out beneath me. The figures paused at the edge of the light. They stared at me, not with malice, but with despair. Then they began to fade into the shadows once more, their hollow eyes lingering in the darkness. When I looked back at the well, it was still, silent again, save for the slow drip of water. But the faces remained beneath the surface, watching, always watching. I stumbled back through the forest, my legs shaking, my breath uneven. The well was still behind me, a hollow abyss waiting, ready to consume anyone foolish enough to look inside. And I knew, some mysteries should never be uncovered. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, a chance to escape the city and get lost in nature. My friends and I packed everything we needed: tents, sleeping bags, flashlights, and a few board games to pass the time. We headed deep into the forest, far from the nearest trail. No cell service, no signals, just us and the wilderness. We found a clearing by a small, still lake, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The air was crisp, the scent of pine filling our lungs. It was peaceful at first. That night, around the campfire, the stories began. Nothing unusual at first, just ghost stories and campfire tales. But as the fire flickered, someone mentioned the abandoned camp across the lake, deep within the woods. "It's been there for years," Alex said, his voice low and hushed. "People say it's cursed. Kids who go there, they don't come back." We all laughed, brushing it off as nonsense. But deep down, the idea stuck with us. The others decided to ignore it, but I couldn't. Curiosity gnawed at me. That same night, after everyone had settled into their tents, I grabbed my flashlight and slipped away from camp. The walk was eerie. The woods were silent, save for the distant hoot of an owl and the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. The lake shimmered in the moonlight as I approached the other side, the camp looming ahead like a forgotten relic. The first thing I noticed was how empty it felt. The tents were still up, but they were torn, left to rot. Old cooking supplies lay abandoned next to burnt-out campfires. It was like the occupants had vanished overnight. I stepped cautiously through the campsite, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every snap of a twig made me pause. Every shadow stretched unnaturally against the flickering light. A chill ran down my spine as I moved further in. Then I saw it. The building. A long, decrepit mess hall stood at the center of the camp. It had broken windows and a gaping front door. My heart skipped a beat. Despite the absence of life, there was a strange sense of something watching me. Inside, the mess hall was a ruin. The tables had rotted away, the floor warped with decay. The walls were covered in old graffiti, sick drawings, symbols I couldn't recognize, and strange messages scrawled in what looked like dried blood. I moved cautiously through the mess hall, snapping photos with my camera. Each flash illuminated something more disturbing: shadows flickering in the corners, faint whispers in the dark. My breath quickened. Then the whispers became louder, more distinct. They sounded like children, soft, innocent voices, but their words were unsettling. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, the weight of the darkness pressing against my back. The whispers echoed in my head and every instinct told me to run, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped. Suddenly, a louder noise, a sharp cracking sound like someone stepping on a branch behind me. I turned, but the room was empty. No one was there. Still, the whispers continued, persistent, growing louder. I swung my flashlight around, desperate for a glimpse of anything. That's when I saw it. The faintest glimpse of a figure in the shadows. A child. Small, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to peer directly into my soul. The figure didn't move, just stood there, silently watching from the darkness. My breath hitched. I snapped a photo without thinking, and when the flash went off, the child's face contorted, twisted into something grotesque and unnatural. Its smile was too wide, teeth too sharp. It opened its mouth in a silent scream. I bolted. The flashlight flickered and went dark, but I didn't stop running. Behind me, the whispers screamed louder, the child's figure darting from shadow to shadow. I crashed through trees, the forest closing in around me. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw the lake. The shore was a blur in the moonlight, but my tent was in sight. My friends were still there, safe, breathing. I fell into camp, gasping for air. They were startled, but I couldn't explain it. I didn't need to. The fear was still etched into my mind. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The next morning, we packed up quickly and left the forest. As we drove away, I glanced back at the distant lake, and in the reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure stood at the edge of the water. The child, watching us, smiling. It had been abandoned for decades, they said. The old carnival on the edge of town was where whispers of disappearances and ghost stories began. My cousin Lily, my brother Matt, and I weren't superstitious, but we were thrill seekers. When we heard about the rumors of the silent Ferris wheel, we knew we had to see it. The carnival grounds were overgrown with weeds, the remnants of rides leaning like skeletons under the pale moonlight. The air smelled of rust and mildew, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the faint creak of old machinery swaying in the wind. "It's just an old theme park," Matt said, kicking a piece of debris. "Nothing scary here," but Lily shushed him. "Do you hear that?" We all stopped. Faint, distant music, circus-like but slow and distorted, drifted through the air. It came from deeper within the grounds where the Ferris wheel loomed like a hulking shadow. "Probably just the wind messing with something," I said, though I didn't believe it. We followed the sound, stepping carefully over fallen beams and debris. The carnival had been frozen in time, like everyone had abandoned it in a rush. Food carts still had faded, rusting signs. A clown cutout with peeling paint grinned at us from a booth, its painted eyes unsettlingly sharp. When we reached the Ferris wheel, it stood tall and ominous, half covered in vines. The metal creaked softly, but there was no wind. And yet one of the cabins swayed gently at the top, as though someone had just climbed aboard. "Look," Lily whispered, pointing to a nearby ticket booth. The window was shattered, and a single ticket sat on the counter, fresh and clean. "Who would leave that here?" Matt asked, his voice low. "It's probably staged. Some prank to scare people," I said, but my voice faltered. Then the music swelled. The Ferris wheel lit up, dim bulbs flickering one by one in unnatural patterns. It began to move slowly, groaning as the rusted gears turned. There was no electricity here, no power source. "We need to leave," Lily said, stepping back, but Matt moved forward, drawn to the glowing ride. "What if someone's controlling it?" "Matt, don't!" I shouted. Before we could stop him, he reached the base of the wheel. He craned his neck to look at the swaying cabin, but his face twisted into horror. "There's someone in there," he said, stumbling back toward us. I grabbed his arm. "What did you see?" "It wasn't human," he whispered. As if in response, the wheel stopped abruptly, the cabin at the top jerking into place. The music cut out, leaving a ringing silence. Then came a voice, distorted and metallic, echoing from nowhere and everywhere. "Your turn," it said. We froze, unsure if we had heard it or imagined it. Then the cabin door at the bottom swung open with a screech, inviting us in. "No way," I said, pulling Matt and Lily away. But the moment we turned to leave, the lights around the carnival blazed to life. Every ride groaned to motion. The carousel spun, its horses moving with unnatural speed. A funhouse door opened with a low moan, shadows flickering inside. The Ferris wheel cabin groaned louder, its open door beckoning us. We tried to run, but the ground shifted under our feet, pulling us closer to the ride. The air grew thick and cold, our breath visible in the moonlight. "What do we do?" Lily screamed. "Don't get on," I shouted, gripping her hand. But then the shadows emerged. Dark figures crawling from the funhouse, the carousel, the food carts. Their movements were jerky, wrong, like puppets held up by invisible strings. They surrounded us, cutting off every escape. The voice returned, louder now. "Your turn." I don't know why I did it, but I stepped forward. "Fine," I said, trembling. "We'll ride. Just let us go afterward." The shadows paused, then melted back into the darkness. The Ferris wheel door swung wider, and the three of us climbed into the cabin, shaking. The ride started, pulling us higher into the air. As we reached the top, the carnival below shifted. The rides disappeared, replaced by black nothingness. The shadowy figures writhed below, their faces melting into screams. The voice returned. "You looked. You stay." But just as I felt the cabin lurch forward, the wheel stopped. The lights blinked out, and the shadows froze. We were sitting in an empty field, the Ferris wheel gone. The carnival was no more, as if it had never been. We ran and never looked back. Weeks later, I developed a rash on my arm. It formed the shape of a Ferris wheel. We had been hiking all day, winding through narrow trails and dense forests. The mountains rose around us, jagged and imposing, and the cool evening air carried the scent of pine and earth. It was beautiful, remote, and serene. After hours of trekking, we finally found a clearing. My friends and I pitched our tents, set up camp, and gathered around a crackling fire. The stars were beginning to peek out from the dark sky, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. "Perfect," Ethan said, stretching out on a nearby rock. "Just us and nature." We had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. No phones, no noise, no interruptions, just the wilderness. But as the night deepened, that peace began to feel uneasy. The fire hissed and popped, shadows flickering wildly against the trees. We heard nothing beyond the crackling of the flames. No birds, no animals, not even the distant hum of civilization. Just silence. "Hey," Emily whispered, pulling her jacket tighter. "Where did the others go?" Ethan and I exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" "Our friends," she said. "They were here a minute ago. They were sitting by the tents, and now, nothing. I scanned the area, but there was nothing. Our friends were gone. Just the three of us remained." "They probably walked off somewhere," Ethan suggested, though his voice wavered. But as the minutes passed, no sign of them returned. No sounds of movement, no distant laughter, nothing, just the stillness of the forest. It was as if they had vanished completely. "We should look for them," Emily said, standing. Her flashlight flicked on, casting long beams into the dark. "Woods. We're not splitting up," I warned her. "Let's stay by the fire." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it's not safe. Whatever happened, they'll come back." But as we sat there, the unease deepened. Shadows moved in the corners of our vision, shapes that seemed too unnatural to be mere tricks of the firelight. We heard faint whispers, almost like voices carried on the breeze, but when we tried to pinpoint them, they disappeared. "I don't like this," Emily said, her voice trembling. "I can feel them. Watching." The fire flickered again, and this time I swear I saw something shift behind the flames. A shadow, tall and humanoid, standing just beyond the perimeter of the light. It was fleeting, impossible to focus on, but unmistakable. "What is that?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said, gripping my flashlight tighter. "Stay close." Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just in our ears, it was inside our heads. Words we couldn't quite make out, but they sent a chill down our spines. The shadows began to close in, slithering closer to the fire. The forest, once a comforting expanse, now felt like a living entity. breathing, alive, watching. Then the faint sounds of movement, something heavy, deliberate, creeping through the underbrush. A low, guttural growl followed, distant but chillingly close. My heart pounded in my chest. "They're coming," Emily said, her breath ragged. "We have to go." Ethan grabbed her hand, and we bolted for the tents, stumbling through the uneven ground. Behind us, the whispers and growls grew louder, more aggressive. The shadows followed, their forms now far more distinct. A twisted, humanoid shape with sharp, jagged claws. The fire flared once more and revealed them. Their faces were twisted beyond recognition, with hollow eyes and grotesque smiles. They moved unnaturally fast, jerking between trees, impossibly silent. And they weren't alone. More shadows emerged, crowding the edge of the firelight, a sea of black, monstrous shapes. I reached our tent first, fumbling with the zipper. Ethan and Emily weren't far behind. The tent finally zipped closed and we huddled inside, holding our breath as the sound of movement surrounded us. But they didn't stop. The growls and whispers continued, so close it felt like they were inside the tent with us. The air grew colder and the feeling of being watched was suffocating. Every second felt like an eternity. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time was warped. But then, just as quickly as they came, the sounds faded. The shadows receded, and silence returned. We emerged from the tent slowly, hearts still racing. The campsite was still and dark. The fire burned down to embers. Our friends were gone, completely vanished. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. "They're still here," Ethan whispered. "They never left." And deep in the distance, a faint, chilling laughter echoed through the forest. It had been years since the last train passed through the old station. Once bustling with life, the platform now sat in eerie silence, overgrown with weeds and shadows. The station had been abandoned for decades, its once vibrant tiles cracked and peeling, walls stained with the passage of time. My friend Alex and I had heard the stories, the rumors of strange sounds echoing down the tunnels, phantom trains that disappeared mid-run, and whispers that came from empty platforms. We had dismissed them as local ghost tales, but curiosity had won out. The station had no electricity. Only the dim light from our flashlights cut through the overwhelming darkness. We walked along the platform, the wooden boards creaking beneath. Our feet louder than we expected in the stillness. The air was thick, carrying an unnatural chill, and every sound was amplified. The shuffle of our shoes, the distant hum of silence. Suddenly, Alex stopped. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" I asked, turning to face him. "There," he whispered, motioning toward the end of the platform. A voice, just breathing. I strained to listen, but there was only silence. No, it wasn't silence. It was something heavier, something oppressive. The darkness seemed alive, shifting subtly with each passing second. We continued forward cautiously. The next platform was only a few steps ahead, but the moment we crossed into it, the air thickened. The flashlight's beam flickered, catching glimpses of faces in the corners, blurred, shadowy faces that dissolved when we turned toward them. Alex whispered again, "They're watching." I shook my head, trying to dismiss the creeping fear. But I could feel it too, eyes on us from the dark corners of the station. Shadows seemed to twist and shift in ways unnatural. "Let's keep moving," I urged. "We'll be fine if we don't stop." But as we approached the third platform, something changed. The platform itself seemed longer than it should be, a trick of the eye. The air grew heavier and the whispers grew louder. They weren't just sounds now. They were voices, faint and fragmented, murmuring things we couldn't quite understand. "Stop," Alex hissed. "I don't think we should be here anymore." "It's just in your head," I said, though my voice wavered. Let's just get to the end of the platform. The end was closer than we realized. I shone my flashlight down the tracks, only to realize there were no train tracks, only darkness. Blackness that stretched beyond the reach of light, a bottomless void where nothing existed, not even the floor of the station. Where are we? Alex stammered, his voice shaking. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the blackness, a tall, slender silhouette. It moved silently, smoothly, as though gliding across the void. Its face was indistinct, a shadow without features, and its arms were elongated, reaching toward us in slow, unnatural motions. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Alex's arm. We sprinted back toward the main platform, but the figure kept pace. It didn't move quickly. It didn't need to. Its presence enveloped the space around us, pressing down on us with a suffocating force. The whispers turned into screams, each one more terrifying than the last. "You can't escape," the voices hissed in unison. We reached the first platform again, but it was no longer familiar. The walls seemed to fold in on us, corners bending at impossible angles, forcing us toward the center. The light from our flashlights flickered, dimming until they were nothing more than faint glows. "Please," Alex cried, dropping to his knees. "Let us go." But the figure was upon us now, its shadowy form eclipsing everything else. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The whispers filled my mind, dark, haunting words that twisted my thoughts into madness. The last thing I saw was Alex, his mouth moving in silent pleas before darkness overtook us entirely. We had just moved into the old apartment building downtown. The place was cheap, secluded, and isolated from the rest of the city. The building itself looked like it hadn't seen anyone go in or out for years. Dust-covered windows, peeling paint, and the smell of mildew filled the air as we stepped through the front door. The landlord had warned us about some quirks, but we didn't think much of it. Our first night in the apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel exposed. We didn't think much of the creaking sounds coming from the floors, or the occasional draft whispering through the cracks. The next night, though, something changed. It started with a knock. One soft, hollow knock at the front door. We froze. There were no visitors. Nobody had been inside the building for as long as we knew. Ryan, always the brave one, made his way to the door and peeked through the peephole. Nothing, just the empty hallway. "Maybe the wind," he muttered, half joking. We exchanged uneasy glances but brushed it off. That was until the knocking came again, this time louder. A relentless, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo through the old building. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. None of us wanted to move. We were rooted in place, our hearts racing. Every knock seemed to come from a different part of the apartment. Sometimes from the door, sometimes from the walls, and other times from above us. The sounds grew closer, surrounding us, closing in as if whatever was making them was right, there in the room with us. That's when the whispering started. It was soft at first, barely audible. Then it grew louder, more distinct. "Let us in." The voice wasn't human, though it sounded like it had once been. The words were muffled, distorted, as if the speaker was trying to force them through, some otherworldly filter. We couldn't understand what was happening, but the fear was overwhelming. Emma tried to move toward the window, hoping maybe there was someone outside, but as soon as she got close, the knocking intensified, the whispers growing louder. We could feel them inside our heads now. We locked ourselves in the bedroom, doors barricaded, hearts pounding. The knocking continued throughout the night, never ceasing, never fading. The whispers turned to screams, shrill and hollow, reverberating off the walls of the old building. It was as if the entire apartment had come alive, its very structure trying to consume us. Morning didn't bring relief. We opened the door to silence, the apartment exactly as we left it. No signs of intrusion, no footsteps, no broken locks. But the whispers, those echoes, never left us. They haunt us now in every quiet moment. Whatever was with us that night didn't come from outside. It had been there all along, waiting, and it never truly left. I work as an audio engineer for a small, independent podcast company. One night, my boss handed me a recording and asked me to clean up the sound for a special episode. Something unusual. It was an old tape, one of those analog cassettes that hadn't been used in years. The label was faded, but it read only 2 words. Listen carefully. Curious, I popped the tape into the machine. The first few seconds were filled with static. Then, a soft voice broke through, barely audible at first. "Hello?" It was a woman's voice, distant, trembling. I turned up the volume to hear better, but as I did, the voice grew clearer. "I need to tell you something. If you hear this, it's too late. It's already too late." I paused the recording, my fingers hovering over the controls. A feeling of unease settled in my stomach. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be listening. But I continued. The voice spoke again. More urgently this time. "Don't trust the man with the glasses. Don't let him in." I couldn't stop listening. The fear in her voice was palpable, and every word sent a chill down my spine. The rest of the recording was a jumble of muffled sounds, breathing, footsteps, and a sharp metallic scraping noise, followed by a loud crash that made me jump. Then came a silence so thick it felt suffocating. "Please," the voice whispered. "They're coming for you. Don't—" The tape cut off abruptly. I rewound the tape and played it again, but this time there was nothing. No voice, no sounds, just dead silence. It didn't make sense. I checked the tape, the machine, everything, but the recording was gone. It was as if it had never been there. I sat in the dark studio, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. Maybe it was a prank, an elaborate hoax. But why would my boss have it? Why ask me to clean it up? Something wasn't right. The next day at work, I didn't say anything. I kept the tape to myself, unsure of how to explain it. When my boss asked about the cleaning, I lied and said there was nothing to fix. He didn't press, but I noticed something odd. His glasses, thick and black, almost like the man from the recording. It was just a coincidence. I convinced myself of that. That night, after leaving work, I decided to head straight home. But as I walked down the street, I saw a man standing across the street staring at me. He was wearing glasses, thick, dark glasses that made his face look oddly distant, obscured. The same glasses as the man from the tape. I froze. My heart raced. Was it him? Had the woman been talking about him? I quickly turned down a side alley, walking faster. The footsteps behind me echoed, growing louder. The man was following me. I broke into a run, my breath coming out in panicked gasps. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, keeping his distance but never breaking pace. Finally, I reached my building. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me, gasping for air. But through the window, I could see him still standing across the street. His gaze was locked on me. He didn't move. Hours passed, and I stayed inside, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then I noticed something else. There, on my kitchen counter, was the tape. The same faded cassette, the same label. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't brought it home. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity before slowly walking toward it. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. I didn't want to play it. I didn't want to hear that voice again. But I had to know. I put it in the recorder. This time, the voice was clearer than ever, right from the start. You shouldn't have listened. I didn't even need to hear more. I could feel it, the weight of whatever was in the recording pressing in on me. The man with the glasses hadn't left. He was here, in the room with me. I turned around, heart pounding. The room was empty, but the silence felt wrong, too quiet, too suffocating. And then I heard the sound of footsteps. They were coming closer. It began as a harmless dare. My friends and I were walking home late one night when we passed the old train station on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for decades, its tracks overgrown with weeds, its windows boarded up. The place was a relic, forgotten and avoided. "You know the story," Jake said, grinning. "They say if you stand on the platform at midnight, the train will come. But it's not for the living." Emma rolled her eyes. "Please, that's just a stupid urban legend." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Prove it. Midnight's in 20 minutes. I hesitated, staring at the crumbling station. The air around it felt wrong, heavy. I didn't believe in ghost stories, but something about the challenge made my skin crawl. "Let's do it," I said finally. We climbed over the rusted gate and made our way to the platform. The station was eerily silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Moonlight cast long shadows, and the air felt colder here, as if the place itself rejected warmth. We stood on the cracked concrete, shivering. The tracks stretched endlessly into the darkness, disappearing into the night. "See?" Emma said. "Nothing to worry about." Jake checked his watch. "Just wait, 2 minutes to midnight." The minutes dragged. The longer we stood there, the heavier the air became, like we were sinking into some unseen void. Then, at exactly midnight, it happened. The faint sound of a train whistle echoed through the air. We froze. Emma laughed nervously. "It's just the wind." But then we felt it. A low vibration beneath our feet, like the ground was alive. A light appeared in the distance, growing brighter, cutting through the darkness like a knife. "That's impossible," I whispered. The light came closer, and the sound of grinding metal filled the air. A train emerged from the shadows, its cars black and glinting like polished obsidian. It wasn't like any train I'd ever seen. Its windows were dark, its wheels emitting a strange rhythmic hum. It glided to a stop in front of us, silent now except for the hiss of steam. The doors slid open. Inside, the train was dimly lit, its seats lined with figures. At first, I thought they were mannequins. Still silent, their faces blank. But then, one turned its head. Its eyes were hollow sockets, its skin pale and stretched tightly over its bones. Slowly, the others began to move, their heads tilting toward us, their eyeless gazes locked on our group. "We should leave," Emma whispered, backing away. But Jake stepped closer. "No way. This has to be a trick. Some prank." "Jake, don't," I said, grabbing his arm. Too late. A figure emerged from the train, a tall man in a conductor's uniform, his face shadowed by a cap. He held out a hand, his voice low and chilling. "Tickets, please." "We don't have tickets," Emma stammered, her voice barely audible. The conductor tilted his head. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 slips of paper. He extended them toward us. "For you." I don't know why, but my hand moved on its own, reaching for the ticket. The paper was cold, almost wet, and as I stared at it, words began to form. My name appeared, scrawled in ink that seemed to seep into the page. "Get on," the conductor said, his voice now echoing. Unnaturally, I shook my head, dropping the ticket. "No, we're leaving." The conductor stepped closer, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the platform. The figures inside the train began to rise from their seats, their movements jerky, unnatural. Emma grabbed my arm. "Run!" We turned and bolted, Jake close behind us. The train let out a deafening whistle, and I felt the ground tremble as if the station itself was about to collapse. Behind us, the conductor's voice rang out, deep and guttural. "You can't outrun it. Your ticket is already punched." We didn't stop running until we were back on the main road. The station was silent again, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked at my hand, I saw the faint outline of the ticket's ink, still etched into my skin. None of us speak about that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the faint whistle of a train in the distance, even when there are no tracks nearby, and I know it's coming for me. We were in the middle of the city, in an old, decrepit apartment complex that loomed over the skyline like a forgotten relic of another time. The building had long since been abandoned, its windows dark and its corridors hollow. It was the kind of place you passed by and never gave a second thought to, but curiosity got the better of us one night. It wasn't just any curiosity, it was the kind that gnawed at the edges of your sanity, the kind that made you ignore the warnings you didn't want to believe. There were stories, of course, rumors that circulated among the city's underground explorers, tales of strange noises, shadowy figures, and doors that opened on their own. But no one had dared venture inside in years. It was just me and two friends, Mark and Sarah, who decided we'd push past the fear and see for ourselves. The complex had long since fallen into disrepair, the once vibrant neighborhood around it now a blur of urban decay. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional flicker of streetlight that barely lit the way. We entered the building cautiously, the smell of damp concrete and mildew hitting us immediately. The hallways were dark, with peeling paint and broken tiles crunching underfoot. The faintest creak echoed through the silence as we made our way up the stairs. It wasn't the sound of someone else. There was no one else. We were alone, but it didn't feel that way. Every corner seemed to hide something, some distorted reflection in a broken mirror, a shadow that didn't quite belong. The further we went, the more oppressive the silence became. Our breaths felt too loud, too unnatural, and we kept our voices to a whisper. When we reached the 5th floor, we stopped. The hallway stretched out before us, its dim light casting long, wavering shadows. We hadn't expected to find anything particular on this floor, but it felt different, heavier. The silence seemed to press against us, each step more difficult than the last. And then we heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from around us, but inside our heads. A voice, distorted and indistinct, muttering things we couldn't quite understand. We exchanged uneasy glances, hearts pounding. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark and Sarah nodded, their faces pale. We didn't speak again, but the whispers didn't stop. They swirled around us, words we couldn't comprehend, as if they were coming from within the walls themselves. As we moved down the hallway, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from one direction. They were all around us, as though the very walls were alive, breathing, whispering. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. Suddenly, one of the doors at the end of the hallway creaked, open, no wind, no breeze, just open. It wasn't like the others. This one seemed deliberate, as if it had been waiting for us. Without thinking, we moved toward it. The air grew colder, and the whispers became a faint chanting, echoing off the walls. Mark pushed the door open further, revealing what looked like a long-abandoned apartment. The furniture was overturned, covered in dust, and the room smelled like something had died there. Rotting wood, mildew, and decay. But what caught our attention wasn't the room itself, but the figure standing at the far end. It wasn't human. At least, not in the way we knew. It was tall, gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, like they didn't belong. Its head tilted. As we entered, and though it didn't speak, we could feel its gaze boring into us. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence, as if the world had stopped turning. I felt something twist inside me, an unbearable pressure, like my chest might collapse at any moment. Mark and Sarah were frozen, staring at the figure. I could see the fear in their eyes. "Run," I heard myself say, but it wasn't my voice. It echoed in my head, louder than ever before. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. We ran. We sprinted down the hall, the oppressive silence broken only by our footsteps. The door slammed behind us, but we didn't stop to check if it had closed all the way. We fled down the stairs, past the shadows, the whispers, and the figure that seemed to follow us through every turn, every creaking floorboard. When we emerged into the night air, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. We didn't dare look. Back at the apartment, at the building that had tried to consume us, the whispers still echoed in my mind, a constant hum of words I couldn't make sense of. Whatever we encountered that night isn't gone. It's still with us, watching, waiting, silent and ever-present. And the apartment? It still stands there, empty and cold, waiting for someone else to enter. We survived, but I don't know if we were meant to. When I was a kid, my family lived on a small farm at the edge of a sprawling cornfield. It wasn't the idyllic countryside you'd see in paintings. Our house was old and creaky, and the cornfield seemed endless, especially at night. It was the kind of place where silence felt like a living thing, pressing in on you when the wind wasn't blowing. One summer evening, my parents went into town for supplies, leaving me and my older brother in charge of the place. The sun had just set, leaving streaks of orange and purple on the horizon. We were supposed to feed the animals and lock up the barn, but instead, we decided to play hide-and-seek in the cornfield. The rules were simple. Stay within the first 10 rows and don't go too far from the house. My brother, always the braver one, volunteered to hide first. He darted into the tall stalks of corn while I counted to 50. The corn rustled as he moved, the sound growing fainter as he pushed deeper into the field. When I finished counting, I called out for him, stepping into the rows with a mix of excitement and unease. The corn loomed high above me, blocking out the moonlight. Every step felt louder than it should have, the dry leaves brushing against my arms and legs. "Come out," I called, trying to sound confident. No answer, just the soft whisper of the wind moving through the corn. I laughed nervously, convinced he was trying to scare me. I pushed forward, parting the stalks, my heart thumping a little harder with every step. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound ahead of me, like footsteps, dragging through the dirt. I froze, listening. "Gotcha!" I yelled, sprinting toward the noise, but when I burst through the stalks, I stopped cold. It wasn't my brother. There was someone standing there, just a few rows ahead of me, their back turned. They were tall and unnaturally thin, with arms hanging too long by their sides. "Jason," I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. My heart pounded as I backed away, trying to retrace my steps. But as I turned, I realized I was lost. The rows of corn looked the same in every direction, and the farmhouse was nowhere in sight. I called out for my brother again, panic rising in my chest. That's when I heard the laughter. It wasn't loud, it was faint and distant, like it was being carried on the wind. But it wasn't Jason's laugh. It sounded hollow, like it was coming from a throat that didn't quite know how to laugh. The rustling started again, this time from all around me. I spun in circles, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was everywhere. My breathing grew shallow as I stumbled through the rows, the stalks closing in tighter. Then I saw it again, the figure. But this time, it was closer. Its head tilted unnaturally as if it was trying to see me without turning all the way around. The laughter came again, louder now, and I bolted, pushing through the corn as fast as I could. The stalks scratched at my arms and face, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I burst into the clearing near the house, panting and covered in dirt. Jason was standing by the barn, holding a flashlight, his face pale. "Where were you?" he yelled, his voice trembling. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but he cut me off. "We need to go inside." Now. That's when I noticed it. His hands were shaking, and his flashlight beam kept darting to the edge of the cornfield. I turned to look and felt my stomach drop. The figure was standing, at the edge of the field, half hidden in the shadows. Its face was still obscured, but I could see its arms, long, spindly things that hung down past its knees. It stepped forward, its movements jerky, almost insect-like. We ran inside, slamming the door and locking it. Jason pulled the curtains, shut, but I couldn't stop myself from peeking out. The figure was gone, but the cornfield seemed alive, swaying as if something was moving through it. We didn't sleep that night. When my parents came home the next morning, we told them what had happened. They didn't believe us, of course, but they didn't have to. That afternoon, we found footprints in the dirt outside the barn. They were huge, far too big to belong to any human, and leading from the footprints were drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled back into the cornfield. We never played hide-and-seek again. It was a rare invitation, one that didn't come often. An old friend's beach house, far from the busy city, offered to us for the weekend. The house was tucked away along the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast, endless ocean. There were no neighbors, no nearby towns, just the house and the sea. We were the only ones for miles. At first glance, the house seemed idyllic. Whitewashed walls, weathered wooden beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the crashing waves below. It was a place made for quiet escapes, the kind of serenity that draws you in. But something felt off. The ocean was beautiful, sure, but there was an unnatural stillness to it. No seagulls, no crashing waves, just a quiet, eerie roar that seemed to echo endlessly. We chalked it up to being far from any usual signs of life, but that gnawing feeling didn't leave. On the first night, things began to shift. We sat by the fire, the sound of the ocean roaring below like a constant reminder that we were isolated. At first, it was subtle, the sound of footsteps on the deck, soft, almost imperceptible. We ignored it, assuming the wind was playing tricks on us, but the wind never sounded like that. Just the house settling, Ryan said. Emma and I nodded in agreement, but there was an edge to his voice, a flicker of doubt we couldn't ignore. By the second night, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. We couldn't ignore them anymore. They were slow, deliberate, circling the house like something was inspecting us. When we would rush to the windows, the deck below was empty. Nothing but the waves crashing far below. Could be an animal, Emma suggested. But animals don't walk in that way. Calm and measured. Whatever it wasn't outside. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, as if they were carried in on the wind, but as the night wore on, they became clearer. Not just whispering, but a voice. A deep, hollow voice that seemed to echo inside my head. Go away. I looked around the room, but neither Ryan nor Emma had heard it, or at least they wouldn't admit to it. It's nothing, Ryan said again, his voice uneasy. Just the ocean. But it wasn't. The voice came back, clearer this time, stronger. Leave. I could feel it in my bones. Something was in the house with us. Something that didn't want us there. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper that came from nowhere, kept us awake. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment. At dawn, I woke to a cold, oppressive silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, waiting for something to break it. I wandered to the windows, hoping for a glimpse of the ocean, but instead my eyes fell on something far worse. Standing just beyond the window, I saw a figure, tall, shadowy, its shape distorted by the mist and the morning fog. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. It just stared, its hollow eyes locked on me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. It felt like time had stopped. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and waved, just once. I didn't wait for it to do anything else. I bolted from the room, heart racing, finding Ryan and Emma in the living room, staring at the same window. "It's here," I gasped. "It's still here." Their eyes were wide, but neither of them spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen. The whispers came again, louder now. This time, we couldn't ignore them. "Leave now." Panic set in. We grabbed our things, not daring to stay another moment. The house felt alive, like it was holding us there against our will. As we stepped outside, the figure was gone. The ocean roared louder than ever, as if it too had been waiting for us to leave. We've never been back to that house. The whispers still haunt me, and sometimes when I'm by the sea, I can still feel the weight of that stare. Whatever was there, it's still waiting. It was supposed to be a casual evening hike. My cousin and I had done this trail dozens of times before. It snaked through the hills above the town, offering stunning views of the sunset and just enough challenge to make you feel accomplished. That evening, we set out later than usual, hoping to catch the stars once the sun dipped below the horizon. We didn't think twice when we passed the old sign at the trailhead. It was rusted and illegible, but we knew the path by heart. The air was cool and still, and the only sounds were our boots crunching on the dirt and the distant chirping of crickets. As the sun set, the trees cast long shadows over the trail, making everything feel a little smaller, a little closer. About halfway up the hill, we stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. The sun was a fiery orange, sinking slowly into the horizon. But as the last rays of light faded, we noticed something strange. There was no moon, not even a sliver. The sky was darker than we had ever seen it, like a heavy curtain had been pulled across the stars. The first uneasy feeling crept in then, but neither of us said anything. We turned on our flashlights and kept walking. That's when we heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the bushes ahead. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make us stop. We scanned the area with our flashlights. The beam landed on nothing but branches and leaves. My cousin shrugged it off, muttering something about deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rustling continued, faint and deliberate, always staying just ahead of us on the trail. We kept walking, faster now, the rhythm of our footsteps breaking the silence. The trail felt different somehow, narrower. The trees seemed taller, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like bony fingers. I tried to tell myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. The rustling stopped. We froze, listening. The night had gone completely silent. Not even the crickets were chirping anymore. My flashlight flickered and my stomach dropped. I smacked it against my palm and the light steadied, but that moment of darkness was enough to make my heart race. Then we heard it, a voice, low and breathy, coming from the trees. Help. It was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. My cousin and I looked at each other, eyes wide. The voice came again, louder this time. It sounded close, too close. Help me. It didn't sound right. The tone was off, hollow, and strained, like someone trying to mimic a human voice but not quite getting it right. Against my better judgment, I called out, asking if someone was there. No response. Then we saw it. A figure stepped onto the trail ahead of us. It was shrouded in shadow, its shape impossible to define. My cousin aimed his flashlight at it, and I felt my blood run cold. The figure didn't have a face. It was smooth and featureless like a mannequin, but it moved like a living thing, jerking slightly as if adjusting to the light. We stood frozen, too scared to run, too scared to move. The figure raised a hand, pointing down the trail. Its arm was too long, the joints bending at unnatural angles. It tilted its head, and for a moment I thought I heard it breathe. Then it turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the trees without a sound. The moment it was gone, the forest came alive again. The crickets chirped, The wind rustled the leaves, and it was as if nothing had happened. Without a word, my cousin and I turned and bolted back down the trail, running as fast as our legs could carry us. The trail felt endless, the trees closing in on us from all sides. When we finally reached the car, we slammed the doors shut and peeled out of the parking lot, not stopping until we were back in town. We never spoke about it after that night. I don't know what we saw, and I don't want to know. But sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can still hear that voice. It wasn't asking for help. It was calling us in. It was supposed to be just an ordinary evening trip, something to break the monotony of everyday life. My friends and I decided to take the old winding road through the countryside, a place none of us had visited before. The idea was simple: leave behind the city's noise and escape into the quiet, untouched beauty of nature. The drive was uneventful at first. The road stretched ahead, snaking between tall, overgrown fields that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and we were lost in conversation, laughing about everything and nothing. The GPS kept pointing us forward, leading us deeper into the unknown. But then the air changed. The atmosphere became thicker, heavier. The trees began to crowd the road, their branches meeting high above like twisted fingers. It felt like we were descending into a different world, one untouched by time. We came to a bend in the road, and that's when it happened. The car jolted, the engine sputtering as it suddenly lost power. I steered to the side, the tires crunching against the gravel. The road was empty, and there was nothing for miles except endless forest. We tried to restart the car, but it was no use. The engine made a low, guttural sound and then gave up entirely. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. "We'll walk to the nearest town," someone suggested, but none of us were sure where that even was. We decided to stay put, hoping someone would pass by and offer help. Our phones were useless, no signal, no bars. It grew darker, and soon the only light came from the dying glow of the car's headlights. We sat in silence, passing around a flashlight to keep the shadows at bay. The woods felt alive. Every creak and crack of the branches was magnified, as if something were watching us. I don't know how much time had passed when we heard it, the sound of footsteps, not from the direction of the forest, but behind us. We froze, holding our breath. The footsteps were slow, measured, like they didn't belong to anyone we knew. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just the soft crunch of shoes on gravel. The sound got closer, and then, to my horror, we saw them. A group of figures walking toward us from the darkness. They didn't run, didn't seem scared or worried. They moved like shadows, their faces obscured by the night, their footsteps steady and unwavering. "Who are you?" someone whispered, but the figures didn't respond. They just kept coming. The flashlight's beam swept over them, revealing details that chilled us to the bone. They were wearing mismatched, tattered clothes, faces void of expression. Their eyes weren't hollow. There was nothing behind them at all. They weren't human, not anymore. Panic surged through us as they stopped, standing in a silent circle around the car. They didn't speak, didn't react to our screams. They just stared, as though they were waiting for something. We knew we couldn't run. There was no point in screaming. We could only sit and hope they would leave, but the longer they stood there, the more I realized they weren't going anywhere. Then, one of them, barely more than a shadow, stepped forward. It wasn't one of the figures we had seen before. This one was different. It was taller, thinner, its limbs stretched unnaturally. It moved with a jerky, unsettling gait, like it didn't quite fit in its own body. It stared at us with cold, black eyes, and for a moment, I swear, it smiled. Not a human smile, but something inhuman, sharp, toothless, and utterly devoid of life. Time seemed to stretch as we sat there, trapped in the gaze of those empty eyes. The air grew colder, heavier. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned my head, away, unable to bear the sight. When I looked back, they were gone. The figures, the strange figure, they were all gone. The forest was silent again, the only sound being the rustle of leaves carried by the wind. We didn't stay. We didn't look back. We ran, screaming into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town and found help. I don't know what they were or where they came from. I don't think I ever want to know. All I know is that some things should remain hidden, buried deep in the shadows of forgotten places. It was the middle of summer, and my friends and I decided to take a day trip to a remote beach, far from the usual tourist spots. We wanted to escape the crowds and find some quiet, peaceful place to relax. The beach wasn't well known, tucked away down a narrow, winding road, hidden from the rest of the world. We arrived in the early afternoon, greeted by nothing but the endless stretch of sand and the gentle lapping of waves. The sky was clear, the sun blazing overhead. The beach, stretched out before us, empty except for a few distant figures far off in the distance. It was perfect. We set up our towels, spread out some chairs, and spent the day swimming, talking, and soaking up the sun. The water was warm, the air salty and fresh. It felt like paradise, away from the noise and rush of everyday life. But as the sun began to dip closer to the horizon, something started to feel off. The air seemed to grow heavier, and a strange quiet had settled over the beach. Even the waves seemed quieter, like they were retreating, leaving behind an eerie stillness. My friends didn't seem to notice, too lost in their own conversations, but I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, an instinctive warning that something wasn't right. I wandered a little closer to the water, scanning the horizon. That's when I saw them. Two figures standing at the edge of the ocean, staring out at nothing. They weren't moving, weren't even talking, just standing there as if they were waiting for something. I didn't want to believe it, but as I moved closer, I could see their faces. They weren't like us. Their eyes were hollow, dark, and empty. There was something wrong with their skin, too. Pale, almost translucent, as though they didn't belong in the sunlight. They turned slightly, as if sensing my gaze, but didn't. Look at me. Their attention remained fixed on the horizon. I felt a wave of panic rising, my breath quickening. I turned and ran back to my friends, my heart thudding in my chest. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Now!" They laughed it off, thinking I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling of those figures standing there, their eyes lifeless, their faces twisted in a way I couldn't understand. As we packed up our things and started heading back, the silence followed us. The beach was still empty, the distant figures still watching us, their presence growing more and more oppressive. I glanced back one last time, and that's when I noticed something terrifying. The figures weren't there anymore, but I could still feel their gaze on me. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything beyond what my eyes could see. Not until that night. It was just a normal evening when my friends and I decided to go hiking. We had heard about a hidden trail deep in the nearby forest, far from any roads or signs of civilization. The air was crisp, the trees towered above us, their shadows stretching long and eerie as we followed the winding path. It was supposed to be a quiet escape, a peaceful night beneath the stars. The trail was narrow, barely more than a dirt path with thick forest on either side. The sunlight dimmed fast, leaving only the soft glow from our flashlights to guide us. We didn't talk much, just walking, listening to the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle in the bushes. It was when we reached a clearing that things started to feel wrong. The atmosphere shifted. The forest was no longer the familiar, welcoming place it once was. The trees seemed taller, their branches forming a canopy that seemed to trap the light, casting deep shadows. The air grew colder, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We decided to set up camp there, thinking it was a good place to rest. But the longer we stayed, the more uneasy I became. The silence was deafening, as though the forest was holding its breath. I glanced around, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, but the woods felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. That's when I heard it. A faint, distant whisper. A voice, barely audible, carried on the wind. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. "Did you hear that?" I asked my friends, but they shook their heads, too preoccupied with setting up the tents. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as night fell, the whispers grew louder, weaving through the trees like they were calling to me. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, the darkness growing thicker. Then, in the stillness, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A shadow, taller than any tree, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, just a black silhouette, watching us. My heart pounded, and I called out to my friends, but they didn't see it. I took a step toward the figure, compelled, despite the fear gripping me. As I drew closer, I noticed something strange. The figure didn't cast a shadow. The very ground beneath it seemed to bend around the shape, as though the light avoided it. It wasn't human. It was more like a void, a gap in reality. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't look away. I was frozen, watching as the figure tilted, its head almost as if acknowledging my presence. Then the whispers became a voice, calm but cold. "You shouldn't be here." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The figure took a slow step forward, and I took a step back, realizing there was no escape. The whispers turned to screams in my head, but still, I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The forest returned to its usual silence, but something had shifted. The unease lingered, heavier now, almost suffocating. My friends, oblivious to what had just happened, continued setting up camp, blissfully unaware. I never told them about the figure, about the whispers that still echo in my mind, and I never went back to those woods. To this day, I wonder if whatever I saw is still waiting. It was just another evening walk through the woods, like countless others I'd taken before. My friends and I had made a habit of these late-night strolls, always curious about what lay beyond the edge of town. The woods were familiar to us, comforting even, filled with tall trees and the rustling of leaves. But that night was different. We set out just after dusk, the golden glow of the sunset fading behind us. The air was cool, crisp, and the distant sounds of traffic seemed to fade away as we ventured deeper into the trees. The woods were quiet, too quiet. There was no laughter, no chirping of crickets, just silence. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet, though. It felt wrong. We walked on, joking and laughing, trying to shake off the oppressive atmosphere, but something was off, something I couldn't quite place. My friends seemed oblivious, lost in their chatter, but I felt the weight of the forest pressing down on me. As we pushed further, we came across an old, decaying wooden bench, rotted and covered in moss. It wasn't there on our previous walks, that much I was sure of. We decided to stop for a moment, stretching our legs, as if the bench had appeared there just for us. I sat down, resting my hands on my knees. The silence felt heavier now. I looked around, but there was no sign of the familiar paths we usually walked. The trees felt tighter, as if the woods were closing in. My stomach twisted. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. One of my friends, Jake, waved me off. "Come on, what's the rush? We've been here a dozen times, there's nothing different." But I wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right. We continued walking, though my steps grew slower. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, and the usual landmarks, the twisted old tree, the hollowed-out log, were nowhere to be found. It was as if the forest had shifted, or we had. Then came the first sound that shattered the silence. a faint echoing whisper that seemed to drift through the trees. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then, there it was again, a whisper, distant yet near, as though it was calling to me. I stopped, heart racing. My friends turned to look at me, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Hear what?" one of them replied, their tone dismissive. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "Never mind. Let's just keep going." We pressed on, but the whispers grew louder, closer. They weren't coming from any one direction. They seemed to drift around us as if carried by the very trees themselves. The shadows deepened, casting the woods in an eerie glow. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, pale and gaunt, its features obscured by the fading light. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a trick. But this figure didn't walk like a person. Its movements were unnatural, jerky and slow, as though it didn't belong to the world we knew. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure turned its hollow gaze towards me. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were dark and empty, like voids of nothingness. "Run," I managed to whisper. But before I could move, my friends stood frozen, transfixed by the figure. I screamed at them to move, but they didn't respond. They were still, staring at the figure like they couldn't look away. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, and I could feel something shift in the air around me. The figure stepped closer, its movements like something out of a nightmare. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest, but my feet wouldn't move, as if the ground itself was holding me in place. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed something. The trees weren't trees anymore. They were faces. Hundreds, thousands of hollow, empty faces staring back at me from the darkness. Their mouths were open, whispering, calling out in that haunting, otherworldly language. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel its presence pressing against my skin, colder than anything I had ever known. Its breath was a chill, a void of nothingness that seemed to consume everything around me. I could hear my friends murmuring, lost in the whispers of the forest, their eyes wide but unseeing. I was alone now, standing amidst the forest that had become a sea of emptiness, the faces of the trees watching me, waiting. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispers filled my ears, louder and louder, until they became all I could hear. And then there was silence. It was a late afternoon when my friends and I decided to explore the old lighthouse by the coast. We had always known about it, a crumbling structure perched on the edge of the cliffs, long since abandoned. No one had used it in years, and the stories about its eerie past were the kind that had always fascinated us. The locals whispered of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances, but we weren't ones to believe in ghosts or urban legends. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the rocky coastline as we made our way down the worn trail. The lighthouse stood tall against the darkening sky, its once white walls now faded and streaked with age. The air was thick with salt, and the distant crash of waves echoed around us. Inside the lighthouse, the light was dim, flickering as though it hadn't been used in decades. We made our way up the narrow, creaking staircase, each step accompanied by a low groan of old wood. The view from the top was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out endlessly before us, the horizon blending into the sky. As we explored, the atmosphere grew heavier. The deeper we went into the lighthouse, the quieter it became. It was as if the building itself had swallowed the sounds of the outside world. We tried to brush off the creeping unease that settled over us. After all, old buildings had their quirks, right? That's when we found the door. It was at the back of the top floor, tucked into the corner of what should have been an empty room. The door wasn't locked, but it felt wrong to even touch it. It stood slightly ajar, as though someone had just stepped through and never returned. We hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. Something about the air felt thick, oppressive. Still, curiosity won out. I stepped forward and pushed the door open, the sound of rusted hinges echoing in the silence. Beyond the door was a narrow hallway, dimly lit by a flickering bulb that buzzed faintly. It led down into the bowels of the lighthouse, toward the basement. Without saying a word, we started down the hall, the distant rumble of the ocean growing louder as we descended. The air grew colder with each step. The walls were damp, and the floor uneven, scattered with debris. At the bottom of the staircase was another door, this one sealed with rusted metal hinges. There was no light, no indication of what lay beyond. One of my friends reached out, slowly turning the knob. It screeched open, and we were hit with a blast of stale, musty air. The room beyond was in complete darkness. We fumbled for our flashlights illuminating the space before us. The room was vast and cavernous, filled with old, broken furniture and scattered bits of debris. But it wasn't what was in the room that made us freeze. It was what wasn't there. The floor was covered in footprints, small, barefoot prints that seemed to have formed in the dust, leading toward the center of the room. Some were fresh, as if they had been made recently. We followed the trail cautiously, the soft beams of our flashlights shaking in our hands. The prints led us to a pile of old crates in the corner. Beneath them, another door stood ajar, this one almost hidden by the debris. Without thinking, one of us pushed it open. The room beyond was even darker. Our flashlights barely penetrated the blackness, but I could see shapes, shadows shifting just beyond the edge of the light. My breath caught as the feeling of being watched became too overwhelming to ignore. Then, from somewhere deep within the darkness, we heard it, a soft whisper. It was distant at first, like the echo of a voice from a dream. But as we stood there, frozen, the whisper grew louder, clearer. "Let us out." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Let us out. Let us out." The fear in my chest was unbearable, but we had to get out. We backed away from the door, our flashlights now shaking uncontrollably. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the entire room, surrounding us from every direction. And then, silence. We stood there, listening, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing came. The whispers were gone. Slowly, we made our way back up the stairs, hearts pounding in our ears. The feeling of being watched lingered long after we left the lighthouse behind, as though whatever was down there wasn't finished with us. To this day, I can't forget the sound of those whispers, the ones that promised we hadn't seen the last of them. I was on a road trip, solo, something I'd always wanted to do. Just me, my car, and the open road stretching ahead. I decided to take a scenic route, away from the highways, weaving through small, forgotten towns. The goal was simple: get lost in the quiet and enjoy the freedom of being alone. By the time the sun started to set, I was deep in unfamiliar territory. The winding road was flanked by endless fields of tall grass that seemed to stretch forever. There was nothing around, just miles of isolation and silence. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool air fill the car, the only sounds being the soft hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. As the light faded, I found myself searching for a place to stop for the night. There was no sign of a town or motel for miles, just endless fields and a single, overgrown dirt path leading off to the side of the road. It wasn't much of a choice, but I decided to follow the path, hoping to find a clearing to park and rest. The path led me to a small, abandoned barn surrounded by broken-down fences. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter. The place felt like it hadn't been touched in years, with weeds growing thick through the cracks in the wood. I parked near the entrance, killed the engine, and sat in the silence, the only sound being the wind rustling through the trees. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't alone. At first, I thought maybe it was just an animal, but the feeling of being watched was too distinct. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation didn't fade. I decided to explore the barn, curious about what might be inside. The door creaked open, revealing a musty, dark interior. I stepped cautiously, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered. What was once used to store hay and farm tools had become a hollow shell of rotting wood and forgotten belongings. I moved further into the barn, shining my flashlight around the dusty space. Old furniture covered in layers of grime, rusted tools scattered on the floor. There was nothing of interest, just reminders of what the place once was. I felt my unease growing, but my curiosity kept me going. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the dim light. My breath hitched as I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there in the shadows, watching. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to step closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but there it was. A human-shaped silhouette standing still as if trapped in the dark. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I took another step, and then another, my legs feeling heavy. With each movement, the figure seemed to draw closer, though it didn't advance itself. It was like we were inching toward each other slowly, relentlessly. When I was just a few feet away, I saw it. The face, or what I thought was a face. Hollow, sunken eyes stared back at me, void of any life or expression. The features were distorted, almost alien. I couldn't tear my gaze away. The barn creaked again, and then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. I stumbled backward, tripping over some debris and falling to the ground. My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet, trying to escape, but the figure moved faster than I could comprehend. I sprinted toward the exit, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I could hear the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps behind me, growing louder, closer. My legs felt like they were on fire as I burst through the barn door, gasping for air. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. I didn't look back, didn't stop. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, the figure far behind, lost in the darkness. I still don't know what I saw that night. Whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't supposed to be there. But I do know this: I'll never take another solo road trip into the unknown. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. It was a cool, quiet evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old, deserted forest near my apartment. The trees there have always been tall and ominous, their branches tangled like they were reaching out toward something beyond. I had always felt a strange sense of peace walking through the woods, but that evening was different. It was getting late, and the sky had grown dark, casting everything in a heavy, oppressive silence. I walked further than I usually did, deeper into the forest, the sound of my boots crunching against the fallen leaves the only noise accompanying me. Then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper, like someone calling my name. I stopped, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. My breath hitched, and I told myself it was just the wind. Still, I felt uneasy. The whisper repeated, growing louder, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. I turned around, heart thudding in my chest. The forest behind me stretched out, dark and still, but there was something off about it. The trees seemed to loom closer, their shadows twisting and shifting in ways they shouldn't have. I hurried back, my legs trembling, but the whisper followed me, always just out of reach. When I got home, I didn't mention it to anyone. I thought maybe I had imagined it, some trick of the mind after spending too much time in the quiet. A week passed and I forgot about the whispers, until the second night. This time, I wasn't walking through the forest. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it again. Fainter at first, but growing louder. The whispering came from the corner of my room. It was almost like a voice now, but distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep within my mind. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispering didn't stop. It was closer now, right by my ear. "Come with me," it said, and the words sent shivers down my spine. I stayed frozen, my eyes wide open, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The whispering didn't fade away. Instead, it seemed to grow louder, more urgent. "You belong with us," it murmured. I covered my ears, but the sound was still there, filling my head. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The next morning, I woke up exhausted, as though I hadn't slept at all. My head throbbed, and I felt a strange emptiness that wouldn't go away. Still, I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? That I had heard voices? No one would believe me. Days passed, and everything felt different. The whispering never stopped, though I tried to ignore it. It was always there, when I was alone, when I was in public. It followed me like a shadow, growing louder, more distinct. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to confront it. I went back to the forest, driven by a need to understand what was happening. As I walked deeper into the trees, the whispering grew louder, until it was almost a scream. Then, in the dead silence of the woods, I saw them. Shapes. Dark figures, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. They didn't move, didn't speak. They were shadows, but somehow, they felt real. The whispering became clearer. "You hear us now," one said. Its voice wasn't human. It was more like a collective, a chorus of countless voices. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't look away. The figures stretched toward me, their features twisted and distorted as though they had no faces, no identity, just voids of endless blackness. "I don't belong here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figures tilted their heads, a soft, eerie sound echoing through the forest. "But you do." I turned to run, but the figures followed as though they were part of the very shadows themselves. The whispering filled my ears, growing louder, until I could hear nothing else. I could feel them closing in, their presence suffocating. I woke up the next morning, lying on the ground, covered in dirt and leaves. The forest was silent again, as though nothing had happened. I was alive, but something had changed. Something inside me had shifted. The whispers have never stopped. They still come to me in the quiet, always closer, always more persistent. And now, I know they'll never let me go. I've always loved hiking, the kind of adventure that gets you far away from the noise of the city. So one weekend, I decided to explore a trail that few people talked about. It was located deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense forests and valleys so remote, the maps barely showed any signs of civilization. My plan was simple: hike all day, set up camp, and enjoy the peace and quiet. The trailhead was nothing more than a narrow dirt path hidden behind a row of thick trees. The first few hours were perfect. Sunlight filtered through the towering pines, birds chirped, and the air was crisp and fresh. The trail became steeper as I ascended, but I didn't mind. I relished the solitude, letting the quiet envelop me. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to find a spot to set up my tent. I chose a small clearing near a stream, tucked away from the trail. It was picturesque, surrounded by towering evergreens and the soft trickling of water. I pitched my tent, unpacked some snacks, and settled down with a book, taking a deep breath of fresh mountain air. The silence was soothing at first, but as the day wore on, it started to feel oppressive. There was no wildlife, no rustling in the trees, no distant sounds of animals. It was as if the forest itself had gone completely still. I tried to push it aside, convinced I was imagining things. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, I decided to take a short walk by the stream. The The water was clear and cold, the perfect spot to reflect. I stood there, mesmerized by the way the light danced on the surface until I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. It wasn't the cool mountain air, it was something else entirely. I looked around, and the forest had become unnervingly silent. Even the breeze had stopped. The only sound now was the rushing water of the stream. I shook off the uneasy feeling and turned back toward my tent. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, a figure stood there, perfectly still, staring at me. It wasn't human. Its shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin. The head was tilted at an odd angle as if it couldn't quite move properly. Its eyes glowed faintly, hollow and unnatural. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were frozen to the ground. I blinked, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I stood there, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, the stillness pressing in on me. I grabbed my pack and rushed back to the tent, every sound echoing too loudly in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. The wind returned, but it howled now, as if the forest itself was alive. Shadows danced around my tent, flickering in and out of view. Every creak of the tent fabric made me jump, my breath quickening with every passing second. At dawn, I packed up as fast as I could, leaving my campsite behind. I didn't care about the trail, about taking in the sights. All I wanted was to get back to the safety of the familiar world. As I stumbled down the trail, my heart still racing, I looked back one last time. The forest was still as quiet and empty as before. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Whatever had been there, watching me, was still out there, waiting. I had always loved the quiet of late-night drives, the stillness of the road, the moonlight illuminating the empty stretch ahead. It was the perfect time to think, to be alone with your thoughts. So, one evening, after a long day of work, I decided to take a drive through the countryside. The roads were winding and dark, but the drive itself was soothing. I didn't have a destination in mind, just wanted to escape the noise of the city and clear my head. The air felt crisp, and I rolled down the windows, letting the cool breeze rush in. As I drove further into the night, the world around me seemed to shrink. The only sounds were the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustling of trees that loomed on either side of the road. I didn't pass another car for miles. It was peaceful in a way that was almost surreal. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something strange. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was a hitchhiker, but something about the way they stood, unmoving, just watching the road, felt off. They didn't seem to be waiting for a car. They were just there, staring. I slowed down, unsure of what to make of it. As I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a dark hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart pounded as I drove past, trying to keep my eyes on the road. I didn't dare look back, but I just knew. It was watching me. The rest of the drive was consumed by a growing sense of dread. The peaceful night had become something else entirely. Every creak of the car, every shadow cast by the moon, felt like they were part of something larger. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overtired and spooked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I reached a small town as dawn began to break. The figure was gone, but I couldn't forget the sense of being watched. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the car keys, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when I noticed something strange. My rearview mirror was cracked, as if something had grabbed it. I haven't driven that road since.